system. Today is day one, and we will start in 5 minutes. Thank you. Please, if you haven't, there's coffee and some sweets behind you. Yeah. Yes, yes. And we also have virtual too. It's in hybrid. The agenda while I'm introduced. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending our Urban Thinkers Campus. This is being organized by the Urban Economy Forum and the World Urban Pavilion in Regent Park in collaboration with the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, the National Indigenous Women's Housing Network, and Fred Victor. We are very excited today to examine housing challenges for women and gender diverse people, to explore solutions and support systems. Our aim is to examine the multifaceted issues surrounding housing inequities and offer actionable solutions. The objective is to foster dialogue and consensus building on how to address housing challenges effectively, both nationally, locally, and internationally. Through shared insights and collaborative efforts, we aspire to envision sustainable urban development frameworks that prioritize the diverse needs of women and gender diverse people in all facets of our society, in particular the housing and homelessness network. Thank you again for being here. And I just wanted everyone to note that the agenda is on the screen or was on the screen, and that you can also look at it through the QR code that has been provided. I would like to now introduce Alyssa Marchenko, who is the UTC Communications Manager at the Urban Economy Forum. Alyssa is a graduate from Queen's University in Global Development Studies with a minor in French. She has been with us since 2020 and is passionate about community involvement and sustainable development that specifically focuses on women and youth.
Good morning. So before we begin, I would like to read our land acknowledgement. UEF and the World Urban Economy Forum would like to acknowledge that the land that we are meeting on is the peoples and land of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. Our work in Toronto also takes place in the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nation, Inuit, Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississauga of the Credit. In addition, we would like to acknowledge the the traditional territories of many Indigenous communities across the entire world. In 1987, the World Commission of Environment and Development's report titled Our Common Future highlighted the great loss to humanity posed by the disappearance of Indigenous peoples and their traditional knowledge and experience. We value the significant historical and contemporary contributions of local and regional First Nations and all Indigenous peoples of North America and across the world. We're thankful for the opportunity to work, learn, and play on these lands.
Thank you, Alyssa. I would like now to introduce Marie McGregor Pitawanakwat, who is the chair of the National Indigenous Women Housing Network and co-chair of the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. Marie is going to do an opening prayer.
Bonjour, Wachie. Pani McGregor, Pifanka, Vishnakas, Lovening Donjaba, Doga, Kwendal, Ushtoda, Kiwednam Nakea, Manadovana Singh. Good morning, greetings. My name is Marie McGregor, Pitawanapat. I'm from South Bay, Dovening. I'm a Doga Kwe, South Bay woman from Wequancombe, unceded territory, Manitoulin Island, Northeastern Ontario. I'm happy that you have asked me to help you out today. So what I'll do is briefly explain what we're going to do. And I hope that you're okay with us making a smoke, and we're going to use the sage. So what I'll do is I'll explain how it goes and what you're asking for. So once the smoke is lit, what you do is you waft the smoke over your head, and you're asking for clear thinking. And you waft it over your eyes, you ask to see clearly. You waft it over your ears so that you're able to hear and listen. Over your mouth so that you can say good things. Over your heart for good intent. And then symbolically, wash your hands and then waft it all over the rest of you so that everything that you do today is done in a good way. And this is one of the ways that we say our prayers. I also want to acknowledge our ancestors underneath all the concrete here. in Toronto. I know that they're there. And I say that because Indigenous peoples have been here since 50,000 years BP, before present. And whenever I come to the city, I know that they're there, even though there's 200 feet of concrete between us and them. Anyway, just wanted to add that. Okay, so I'll stop there. We'll make smoke, and then I'll come around to each of you, and then we'll know what to do. And those that are online, and if you want to do the same thing where you are, over your head, over your eyes, over your ears, etc. Okay, and then we're done, and then we can proceed with the rest of the morning's work. Eventually. Oops.
Thank you, Marie, for that wonderful opening prayer. We are now going into welcome and remarks. I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Reza Pupazeri. Reza is an architect with over 20 years of experience, including as an international urban researcher, focusing on the concept of architecture and sustainability. In 2018, he founded and is now chair of the Urban Economy Forum, and he is working on urban development projects globally. Rez established the strategic partnerships between the United Nations and Government of Canada to establish the World Urban Pavilion in Regent Park, a collaborative initiative between UEF and UN Habitat and supported by the Government of Canada and the Daniels Corporation.
Reza.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Water Bank Pavilion. Pavilion is a global platform showcasing innovative urban solution, cutting-edge technology, and best practices in sustainable urban development. This dynamic space facilitates knowledge sharing, collaboration, and networking among urban stakeholders, fostering collective action to shape the future of cities and communities and achieve a better urban world. Welcome, everyone, to the Urban Thinker Campus as an interactive think tank for World Urban Campaign. Today, we gather to discuss a critical issue that affects the world, housing challenges for women and gender diverse individuals. As we know, housing is a fundamental human right, yet many individuals face discrimination and marginalization in their search for a safe and secure place to call home. Women and gender diverse individuals are disproportionately affected by housing insecurity, facing a range of obstacles, including gender-based violence, systematic discrimination, and limited access to essential resources and support services. We must work toward creating inclusive and equitable housing solutions that prioritize the needs and experiences of women and gender diverse individuals. Over the next 3 days, we will share stories, ideas, and solutions together as a workshop. We will learn from each other's experience and expertise. We will collectively imagine a future where housing is a right, not a privilege. So let us begin this journey together with open heart and mind. Let us listen, learn, and grow. And let us work together creating a world where everyone has a safe and secure place to call home. Thank you.
Thank you, Reza. I would now like to call on Dr. Fazila Dadfar, who serves as the Chief of Research and Development at UEF and Head of Networking and Capacity Building at the World Urban Pavilion. Fazila is instrumental in organizing the flagship annual forum at UEF, which fosters connections with various national and international universities and managing development projects and events within the organization. So.
Good morning. Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to your UTC. I am honored to stand before you today at this pivotal gathering focused on housing challenges for women and gender diverse people, exploring solution and support system. Our collective presence here underscores a shared commitment to addressing one of the most pressing issues of the time, the housing concern of women. As we delve into the multifaceted dimension of the topic, it becomes abundantly clear that a gender-based analysis is not just important, it's essential. In Canada, understanding the remedying women's housing concerns necessitates a comprehensive examination that embraces the diverse experience and needs of women across various intersections of identity. Today, our purpose is twofold: to extend the dialogue on the complex and intersectional factors underlying women's housing issues, with a special emphasis on homelessness and women's safety. We recognize that the experience of women are diverse, shaped by a myriad of factors such as gender-based violence and economic disparities. These factors not only contribute to women's housing instability, but also pose significant challenges in ensuring the safety and well-being of both women and their children. At UEF and the Pavilion, our mandate resonates deeply with the principles of inclusivity and safety for all. We understand that women play a pivotal role in nurturing and safeguarding future generations. It's with this understanding that we have launched the Canada Women and Urban SDGs program, a collective initiative aimed at advancing gender equality and sustainable development. This program launched on the occasion of International Women's Day on 2024 with participation of the Honorable Minister of Women and Gender Equality of Canada as part of Canada Frontrunner of Urban SDG, underscores our commitment to leverage the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework for transformative changes. Recognizing the intersection and the interconnection of the SDGs, we advocate for an intersectional gender approach that harnesses this aggregated data to inform policy development and implementation at the local level. We must acknowledge how gender-based violence serves as a significant barrier to recognize the SDGs and addresses it as a upstream factor that undermines progress across multiple dimensions. Today, as we gather to engage in meaningful dialogue, I extend my gratitude to each and every participant for their invaluable contribution. It's through collaborative efforts such as this that we can drive tangible changes in city management policies and legislations, paving the way for a more equitable and inclusive future for women. In closing, I would like to introduce our upcoming 6th Urban Economy Forum titled Financing Sustainable Tourism, Advancing Quality of Life, will be held on September 25 to 27, 2024 in Toronto and Kitchener in Canada. In this forum, we intend to explore the potential of tourism as a major factor and resource that can be tapped by cities worldwide. Please join us in this important event and participate in leveraging the discussion on tourism effect on various dimensions of social life. I urge us all to approach today's and September discussion with empathy, determination, and a shared commitment to action. Let us harness the power of collective advocacy to create positive, lasting changes that uplift and empower women in their pursuit of safe and secure housing. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you, Fazela. I would now like to introduce Stefania Secchia, who is the Director of Advocacy and Communications at the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, following a decade working as a journalist. Stefania has worked with Keepers of the Circle to develop internal communications capacity, delivered communication strategy, and mentored Indigenous women to take on the role of communications team lead. And before that, she was at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. Stefania.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us here. My name is Stefania Secchia, and I'm the Director of Advocacy and Communications at the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. I'm calling in today from Vancouver, the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. Our network started small, a group of advocates, grassroots organizers, academics, and lived experts came together to address the unique ways women and gender diverse people experience homelessness. Why? Because it is an urgent crisis in Canada requiring immediate action. Housing insecurity and homelessness for this group is largely invisible, and they remain profoundly underserved across many systems and services. Women and gender diverse folks, especially those who are multiply marginalized, face systemic barriers to accessing safe, affordable, and adequate housing. This committee sought to change that. And in 2020, they formalized as the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, launching a groundbreaking research report called The State of Women's Housing Need and Homelessness in Canada. This comprehensive literature review explores evidence on the unique causes, consequences, and experiences of homelessness and housing precarity for women and gender diverse people. We followed this up with the Pan-Canadian Survey on Women's Homelessness, the largest national gender-specific survey on housing need and homelessness in Canada to date. This survey of 500 participants provides insight into the unique causes, conditions, and consequences of housing precarity and homelessness for women, girls, and gender diverse people. Slowly, the network grew. We continued our research, our advocacy. We built a steering committee across lived experts, organizers, housing providers, and more who guide our action. Then in June 2022, the Women's Network and our sister organization, the National Indigenous Women's Housing Network, achieved a significant milestone by launching 2 historic human rights claims. These claims documented key violations of housing rights experienced by women and gender diverse people throughout the country. The development of these claims was a collaborative effort involving advocates who have long been involved in highlighting unique experiences of women and gender diverse people. The Women's Network, alongside our sister network, played a vital role in mobilizing communities, raising awareness, and ensuring that the voices of those affected by housing insecurity were at the center of the claims process. By highlighting the systemic issues and violations of housing rights faced by women and gender diverse individuals, the claims sought to drive a transformative human rights process that centers the lived expertise of rights holders across Canada. On May 12, 2023, the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate, after reviewing our 2 submissions, announced the referral of the claims to the National Housing Council. The Council is now tasked with the responsibility to establish a national review panel on the government's failure to prevent homelessness among women and gender diverse people. My colleague Khulud will speak more about this historic process shortly. Ultimately, the work of the network is to advance the diverse voices of women, girls, gender diverse lived experts, and their allies to lead transformative, gender-specific solutions that reduce and end housing precarity and homelessness through adopting human rights and intersectional feminism approaches. We exist because homelessness and housing precarity for women and gender diverse people is in a deep crisis. We have spent decades getting into this mess, and we do not have the luxury of more decades to get out of it. Women and gender diverse people are dying on the streets, if they even make it that far. The sector takes a one-size-fits-all approach. Women and gender diverse folks are more likely to experience invisible homelessness by couch surfing or relying on the kindness of friends and loved ones because of the violence they experience when on the streets. We really don't know the full scope of how many women and gender diverse people experience homelessness. What we do know is grim. 36% of people experiencing homelessness in Canada are women identified. 90% of families using emergency shelters are headed by single women. 21% of single mothers in Canada raise their children in poverty. 7% of women in Canada have experienced hidden homelessness at some point in their lives. Approximately 1,000 women and their children are turned away from domestic violence shelters across Canada each day, many of them returning back to their abusers. 26% of gender diverse people have lost their housing due to discrimination or harassment. Our healthcare, education, child welfare, and criminal justice systems all contribute in some way to women and gender diverse people's housing instability or homelessness. This is why we are here, not just today, but every day. And I hope there is a point where our network no longer needs to exist as we currently are, that the generations behind us will someday see us in a historical context, no longer relevant. I'm excited for you to meet the fantastic people on our panel today and learn more about this incredibly important issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefania. I would like to now introduce our special guest, Marie McGregor Pitawanakwah, who is the chair of the National Indigenous Women's Housing Network. Marie, as she has stated, is Anishinaabe on Manitoulin Island, northeastern Ontario in Canada. She has developed a business called Shoespegian Training Services, which provided training and development to First Nation communities and NGOs, primarily in northwestern Ontario, which focused on community and business development. Her business venture has won an award from the Northern Ontario Business Awards. Marie?
Greetings again. Buenos dias, bonjour, konnichiwa, ni hao ma. Anyway, we're living in an international environment. So I want to talk a bit about, I serve as the co-chair to the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, and I serve as the chair to the National Indigenous Women's Housing Network. And I bring to this the lived experience of homelessness, not through economic means, not through spousal violence, but through a terrible, terrible misunderstanding about the meaning of traditional Indigenous homeland. And I want to say to you that what we Indigenous peoples have here in Canada is we still hold Indigenous allodial land title. And what's missing with women's, in particular Indigenous women's homelessness, is secure land tenure. The idea of secure land tenure is a very important concept that affects Indigenous peoples worldwide. My understanding is that there are 370 million Indigenous peoples around the globe, and very many of those have been dispossessed from their traditional territories. And so the element that's missing in order to help them have safe, adequate, culturally appropriate housing is secure land tenure. And in Canada, even that is the case here. And I want to cite some numbers at you. One of them is Canada's land mass is 9,985,000 square kilometers of land from coast to coast to coast. It's the second largest land mass in the world. The only other one that's bigger is Russia. And when I started to look at, well, how much of that land is Indian Reserve land? And I looked at the numbers, and percentage-wise, it consists of a mere 1/3 of 1%. So in effect, Indian people, status Indians who live on Indian reserves, live on less than 1/3 of 1% of our reserve land. And that's because the reserves were created by federal legislation in 1876. It's called the Indian Act. And it specifies who can be registered, what happens when you're born, what happens throughout all your life, and what happens when you die. So it's cradle to grave control. The 5 C's: corralled, contained, counted, controlled, captured. So I'll stop there with that. That's National Indigenous Women's Housing Network numbers. And as Stefania started to talk about earlier, the statistics about women are alarming and very serious and hurtful. And we're living in a country that has such space and resources and talents, and it is alarming and kind of sad to me that there is even one person homeless. And actually, when you think of it, the whole world, the whole globe, Mother Earth, Shikakamekwe, every single human being on that world has a home. Each one of us belongs here. Each one of us has a home. The biggest problem, of course, is the problem of shelter, adequate shelter, safety, security, place to get clean, a place to cook, a place to raise your family, a place to, carry out your hobbies and things like this. So those are the things that drive us. And as Stefania said, hopefully one day our organizations won't need to exist anymore. I'll stop there, Neeraj.
Thank you, Marie. We now move on to our speaker series panel. I would like to begin with bringing forward Arlene Hash, who is going to be the moderator of this session and will introduce the speakers, who will be talking specifically on housing and homelessness issues and challenges in our current situation. Arlene founded an urban-based family resource center that provided support to marginalized women and their families, the majority of which were Indigenous. She is well known across Canada's Arctic as an advocate for social change and in recognition of her work, which was awarded the Order of Canada in 2009, and then the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal in 2012. Of equal importance, Arlene was honored with the Star Blanket ceremony guided by wisdom keepers and hosted by Keepers of the Circle, an Indigenous hub in northeastern Ontario. Arlene, the podium is yours.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to announce these amazing speakers. Each speaker will have about 10 minutes. And I won't introduce them all at once because I think that you'll just forget really how sort of wonderful they are. So I'll introduce each speaker as they go, and I'll begin with Khulud Beg. So up front, I'll apologize already for mispronouncing anything or misstating anything, and I'll certainly understand if speakers correct me. So Khulud Beg is a wonderful, incredible woman who is the Director of Policy and Community Engagement with the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. She also serves as the lead on housing and homelessness research with WIN as the lead researcher, and is a key partner with Keepers of the Circle. Khulud holds a master's in global development studies from Queen's University and has valuable experience in community-based participatory research with a key focus on gender-based analysis and Indigenous methodologies. Previously, Khulud has led gender equity and housing files at the City for All Women's Initiative and the Native Women's Association of Canada. Her key focus in all her work is to create and hold space for lived experience voices in decision-making. So you can begin now, Khulud. Thank you so much for joining the panel.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Arlene. I'm quickly going to share my screen and I'll get us started right away. I'm hoping it's going to be visible to folks in a couple of seconds. Perfect.
Yeah.
So great. So I'm speaking today on this amazing 2-year-long journey that the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, alongside the National Indigenous Women's Housing Network, has been on, which is the work that we've been doing in engaging with the National Housing Strategy Act, which is also the legislated Housing as a Human Right Act in Canada. And the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, along with NIN, was one of the first groups to sort of engage with that act and submit our claim as soon as a federal housing advocate was appointed. So I'm going to kind of go through the process of the work that we've done, the importance of engaging with the human rights legislation for us, and the kind of hopes and aspirations we have from engaging with something like this. If at any point in time you can't hear me, or my audio is muffled, or you want me to repeat something, please do just raise your hand if you're on Zoom, or you can just let me know if you're in person as well. So very quickly, in the time that I have today, I'm hoping to talk about the right to housing principles and framework and how they are in action in Canada. I'm going to talk about how the two networks that we have, the Women's Network and the National Indigenous Network, how we came together to put together the two human rights claims that we submitted and what has come out of it so far. And then I'm also going to talk about what's up ahead for us in terms of the work that we're doing on the human rights claims. So many of you might already be familiar that the right to housing is internationally recognized in the ICESCR, which is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And that document specifically recognizes that the right to housing should not just be interpreted as a very narrow or restrictive definition, which equates it with having four walls or a limited physical structure that can suffice at home. When we talk about the right to housing, we're not just talking about a roof over one's head exclusively or looking at shelter as commodity. We're specifically also talking about someone's right to live in security, in peace, in dignity, in safety. And all of these concepts become really critical and important, particularly when we talk about the right to housing for women and gender diverse people. So it's really critical to understand that housing is never just about having four walls and a roof over your head. It's so much more. It's about how we live. It's about how we connect, how we exist in community. It's about how we feel safe. It's about how we feel dignified. And that's sort of where all of our work has focused when we talk about the right to housing. So internationally, there are 7 key features that are recognized in the right to housing. One of them, that they are legal security of tenure, availability of services and material, affordability, habitability, accessibility, location, and cultural adequacy. And all of these pillars are also recognized in our national legislation, which ratifies how the right to housing is articulated in international frameworks. So really clearly, the right to housing does not mean that the government's providing everybody a house, but that the government is creating all sorts of mechanisms and abilities for people to live and choose to live in the ways that they want to live. So the ideas around agency, autonomy, and where people think they can live safely and securely is what the right to housing really means. So what the right to housing then really requires governments to do is to demonstrate measurable progress towards ensuring all people having access to adequate housing. It requires governments to adopt measures to ensure and use all appropriate means to end homelessness and housing need, prioritizing those in greatest needs. It also requires governments to use the maximum available resources to address housing insecurity crises. And then it also requires governments to provide remedies for systemic violations of the right to housing. So especially when we talk about the gender-based impact of housing crises, homelessness, housing insecurity, we're talking about the systemic issues or violations to the right to housing, and how can the right to housing legislation play a role in addressing those. So as I was speaking to it earlier, the National Housing Strategy Act is quite monumental in what it is and what it's hopefully able to do when it comes to ensuring the right to housing for everyone in Canada. So the National Housing Strategy Act is the first Canadian legislation to recognize a socioeconomic right as a fundamental human right, which is quite monumental. It commits to the progressive realization of the right to housing based on international human rights law. So the seven features or pillars of the right to housing that we just visited. It also addresses systemic issues rather than focusing on just individual rights. So it really sees where and how housing systems are failing groups or specific populations. The legislation also requires a rights-based strategy that is accompanied by goals, timelines, monitoring, and accountability. So it really sets up an accountability mechanism for the government to specifically abide to, and then also provides mechanisms to get submissions, hearings, findings, and systemic remedies for socioeconomic rights. So the right to housing mechanism, the way that it's set up in Canada, is allows for people to create and submit their claims to the federal housing advocate, who's kind of I would want to say like the representative or the watchdog that represents the legislation in Canada. And I'll go a little bit more into that. So the legislation is accompanied by three accountability mechanisms. All of them work together to ensure an oversight on systemic violations of the right to housing. We have the National Housing Council, the review panels, and the Federal Housing Advocate all functioning as accountability mechanisms under the right to housing legislation. And all of them work through or report to the Minister of Housing, who also has a really critical role to play in the work that happens in the right to housing. The Federal Housing Advocate is a really critical and important player in all of this. And this is the person that we work with more directly, or that we have been submitting our claims to as well. So the Federal Housing Advocate is a watchdog on the right to housing in Canada. She's appointed by the government of Canada, but she functions independently, part of the accountability mechanism that's established through the National Housing Strategy Act, and most importantly, is an ally and champion for rights for right holders all across Canada. The Federal Housing Advocate has many critical roles to play. So the Federal Housing Advocate can conduct research and engagement on systemic violations. She can receive submissions from individuals and groups about human rights violations. She can make recommendations to the Minister of Housing. And once those recommendations are made, the minister has to respond within 120 days in the House of Commons and Senate. She can speak out about human rights violations, and she can amplify the voices of rights holders. So it's really important and critical for us as right holders and as civil society organizations to recognize the role that's played through the Federal Housing Advocate and utilize that in our advocacy for housing security. And it's even more important to do that as we're advocating for systemic violations to be recognized and addressed. So what have we been doing in all of this, in context of all of this? So as I was saying earlier, the Federal Housing Advocate's Office has a submission portal that has been made available to anybody and everybody from Canada to make claims and make submissions identifying systemic violations to the right to housing. And the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network and the National Indigenous Housing Women's Housing Network in June 2022 came together with a bunch of community members and advocates and people with lived experience and scholars and academics to put together two really critical claims that recognize and noted different housing rights violations that are impacting women and gender diverse people all across Canada. And these housing rights violations specifically were supported by all of the research that Stefania that was earlier mentioning that has been done by the Women's Network so far. It was supported by narratives and stories from our lived experts, and it was supported by community advocacy and collaborative advocacy that both of the networks have taken on. So these claims were put together, they were launched on the steps of the Parliament in collaborative effort, and were submitted to the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate as a way of pushing forward and getting the violations or systemic violation of the right to housing for women and gender diverse people. And this is just a bit of a graphic to recognize the process that we went through. So as I was saying earlier, we came together and we launched these claims on the step of the Parliament. It was a really important and big day for the work that we've been doing, because one of the biggest challenges in housing policy is how gender blind it is and how it fails to address or create specific policy solutions for women and gender diverse people. And we see that over and over again in our research. So putting forward these claims really was an opportunity for us to articulate how the needs and the gendered impacts of housing crisis impact women and gender diverse people and impact the ways that they're able to access housing and support systems. Then in 2023, we've yet again gathered with community members, lived experts in Toronto to host our first ever national symposium on the right to housing for women and gender diverse people. This event was attended by the Federal Housing Advocate, and it was an opportunity for folks to bring the claims in person to the Federal Housing Advocate, to advocate in person to the Federal Housing Advocate, and to really hone in on the mechanism available through the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate to push forward on the systemic violation to the right to housing for women and gender diverse people. These are again some great visuals from that event. And what ended up happening as a result of all of that advocacy that we did in 2022 was in May 2023, we heard that the Federal Housing Advocate had requested a review panel into into government's failure to eliminate homelessness among women and gender diverse people. And this review panel is critical and important because it, for the first time in history, recognizes that the systemic violations to the right to housing for women and gender diverse people need to be looked at as a gendered housing crisis, and that it needs to be supported by gender specific, not just the inquiry, but also solutions. So, like I was saying, first time in history that a human rights review is going to be focused on homelessness among women and gender diverse people. And also, we are seeing a recognition of this human rights crisis and priority issue after many, many decades of court cases, advocacy, and organizing. So it's taking many, many people's advocacy and many years of advocacy to get the housing crisis recognized as a gendered housing crisis and having gendered impacts. So what this essentially means is that anticipating anytime now, we will be seeing the National Housing Council establish a 3-person review panel that will be responsible for reviewing the issue of government's failure to eliminate homelessness for women and gender diverse people. This review panel is going to involve written testimony and oral testimony during public hearings. So it's going to be open to public for anyone to participate in. And there will be an opportunity for women and gender diverse people with lived experts to come and testify. And this is sort of what we're hoping to see from now until the end of the year. So this is just really a visual kind of summarizing everything I've talked about. We started off with doing these claims in community in collaboration. We submitted those claims for review and referral. The claims got referred. We're now waiting for public hearings to begin, which will then lead to a report and recommendations presented to the Minister of Housing, where we're going to hear a response from the Minister of Housing within 120 days in the House of Commons and the Senate. All of this is really critical, and it represents a really important component of our work because housing is a human right, and it really says that for the first time in history, we're going to be hearing gender specific recommendations that can be used to pursue justice at international level, that there is going to be a public record of documenting human rights violations, particularly towards women and gender diverse people. There's going to be the voice of the right holders at the forefront, and most importantly, that there is a responsibility upon government to respond within a specific time period. This is as we gear up towards the process and as we move forward to the process, the work of the Women's Network really happens in collaboration with community groups and community members. So if you're hearing today and you're interested in participating in this historic process, we do want you to get in touch with us. And we're also very open to just come and talk to folks about how they can get engaged, how they can get organized, and how they can engage with this historic process. So with that, I'm going to finish off today, and I can also answer questions during the Q&A session. Thanks, folks.
Thank you so much, Khulod. Now we're going to invite Dr. Jane Malafont to begin her presentation. Jane is the assistant professor at McGill University, Gender Diversity, Lived and Community Leadership in Housing Justice Work. Her research sits at the intersection of housing and educational rights, with a focus on how communities most impacted by barriers to housing are implicated in activism, advocacy, and changes to policy. Jane's previous research focused on anarchist youth, living in rural Canada. As a farm girl, I love that, with an emphasis on their autonomy and activism outside of traditional political realms. So exciting. This research took place at the Social Anthropology Department at York University and was supported by the SHRC. I will say her doctoral research focuses on educational access for young people experiencing housing precarity and poverty, and aims to make concrete shifts in how youth perspectives and experiences shape institutional interventions. Throughout her academic career and personal life, Jane has held a commitment to open and fair work, whether scholarship or activism, which attempts to break down traditional hierarchies. She continues to carry out research which is participatory and community-based at its core, with an explicit focus on research which supports action in the everyday lives of people. Drawing on her own experience as well as the experience of those she works with, she aims to continue work which directly improves the supports and opportunities for precariously housed youth and young people more broadly. Thank you so much, Jane, for joining us.
Thank you, Eileen. Can folks hear me okay? All right. If you can't, just like yell at me, because I might not see everyone. Can people see those slides as well? Yay. All right. Great. Thank you so much, Eileen. I'm really excited to be hearing from all of you so far. I wish I could be in Toronto in person, but it's great to hear the work that's going on. And luckily, I'm gonna, I think, build on some of the things that Khulud was sharing. And I'm going to speak a bit about, I guess, the second part that we often talk about when we're talking about gender, the experiences of housing and homelessness, or housing rights, specifically looking at gender diverse people. And so I'm going to share from a couple of projects that I've been working on. And as Eileen mentioned, a lot of the work I do not only starts in my own experiences, but also aims to be grounded and accountable to communities that are most impacted by housing rights violations. And so I'm Jane Malenfant, and so I'm here in Tiohtià:ke, show called Montreal at McGill University. And I mean, I think you've already explained some of the ways that I come at this work from. I come at this work as someone who navigated housing precarity in my own life and saw a lot of my community do the same, and also saw the ways that shapes also intersections with education, healthcare, criminal legal systems. And so the stuff that I'm going to be sharing today builds on some of the work of the Women's Network that was just shared, as well as some work with the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate, but really thinking of how housing sits within other systems and how other systems may, support people either finding housing that's stable, safe, and good for them, or not doing that. And so I come at this work also as someone who comes from Kapuskasing, Ontario. So I'm not here from Tiohtià:ke. And I've lived in many places in many different ways. And so that's where I begin this work. And I also, I'll be sharing two projects. And so the first, and you can access both of these on the womenshomelessness.ca website, built off of a survey that the Women's Network did in 2019. We really wanted to engage with those who were identifying as gender diverse, who weren't necessarily identifying as women within that survey, to see what are the unique needs of this population, as opposed to just thinking of women and gender diverse people as a large group. And so to do this work, I worked with Caitlin Schwan, Alex Nelson, and Mickey Watchorn. And we also spoke with people who had firsthand and practitioner knowledge of housing rights violations to look at the literature, the lived knowledge, and the professional knowledge to get an idea of what these experiences look like. I also want to share something that we'll be launching soon, which is kind of a follow-up on that project that I've been undertaking with Alex again, and Charlotte and Jody, which is building on that through literature, looking at different intersecting systems. So education, healthcare, criminal legal systems, social assistance, and other intersecting ways that people are navigating social systems and state systems. To think through how we can not only be assuring the right to housing and be equipping people who want to be allies to Two-Spirit, trans, and other gender diverse people, but also thinking of the duty bearers, but also just anyone who's interested in supporting folks through highlighting the resistance and the actions that communities are already often undertaking to keep one another alive in spite of systems not serving them. And so I'm going to draw on some things from these two projects. The things that have come out broadly in all of this work is, well, one, that the shelter system isn't necessarily the place where housing rights are assured, but it is a system that a lot of people touch when they're facing housing rights violations. And the shelter system in particular, again and again, there are a lot of barriers with the shelter system, I think, but it's really rigid in how gender is imagined. And so people who might identify as non-binary or who might otherwise not fit into really traditional conceptions of gender may not feel comfortable, safe, or able to access spaces. And what we were seeing in work is that often the brunt of work to accommodate those who have expansive gender is falling on traditional women's services. And so there's a lack of resources to support that. There's often a lack of education on what that should and could look like, both for staff. Staff were saying, I would like more training. I would like to know more about what this would look like, but also that we can't be downloading all of that onto women's services, that there needs to be some other options, and that the shelter system might actually need to be reimagined, perhaps reimagined away from emergency responses, but maybe not. But as they exist in a way that's really inaccessible for folks and often is unsafe for people. What we also found across all of these projects, and that I've seen in my own work, is that discrimination often occurs before people even experience homelessness. They're experiencing discrimination in healthcare systems. They're experiencing discrimination in schools, even from a very young age. So when we're thinking of maybe looking at preventing homelessness altogether, those are places where actions to support people's well-being and support people's safety, and support people's cultural supports, all of these could be really influential. But again, I wanted to highlight that in the absence of the state taking care of folks or systems serving folks well, people in community are taking care of each other. And that's something we heard again and again. And there needs to be a really keen eye on thinking of not necessarily risk or resilience, but people said, we actually want to talk about resistance and what that looks like and what that tells us about how systems could be organized differently. So I wanted to share a couple statistics. I always hate throwing out statistics and not having enough room to maybe like contextualize them, but I'm going to do exactly that. Because I think actually the survey undertaken by the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network a few years ago is some of the only data that we have about the experiences of gender diverse people. And so what we found in this, and you can check out the reports for more information and analysis on this, but it echoes what I hear when I do work in my community here and across Canada. So we saw that 26% of gender diverse people have lost their housing due to discrimination and or harassment. And this is across the housing spectrum. 43% reported experiencing discrimination from landlords and property managers on the basis of their gender. And so we know that discrimination from landlords is a huge barrier for a lot of folks for having stable housing. And this was echoed in these statistics. 41% reported having experiences of discrimination and or judgment from homeless shelters or drop-ins. And so this is something that came up a lot when we were talking to people too, that this idea that like, I'm not even going to access services because I already know that I'm going to be treated badly or I'm going to be treated in a discriminatory or harmful way. This is also something that we saw broadly, but 44% of gender diverse participants reported having to move out of their housing due to problems with the condition of the housing. And so we know that there's less and less housing that people can be accessing in general, but also that the conditions of that housing mean that it's not actually a home that's reasonable for people to be staying in. 69% of gender diverse people reported being unable to find or maintain housing due to affordability issues. And I'm sure this is something that will come up over the next couple of days of discussion. 41% reported feeling unsafe in their place or their neighborhood. And when we look at gender, safety is something that comes up a lot in discussions of what makes a home feel like a home, and safety is something that we really need to be paying attention to. And the reason we started trying to look at intersecting systems is because public systems failures was something that came out so strongly in this data. And so 19% of gender diverse people were more likely to indicate the healthcare system contributed to their housing and homelessness than their cisgender counterparts. And this was something that comes up in the literature a lot. Almost a third of gender diverse people indicated the education system contributed to their housing instability and homelessness. This is where a lot of my work lives. And that was almost 3 times more than cisgender women who answered the survey. A third of gender diverse people indicated the criminal justice system contributed to their housing instability and homelessness. And the criminal justice system was something people said is almost unsalvageable and actually might need to be addressed in a really in a radical way to be supporting gender diverse people. Gender diverse participants were significantly more likely to have child welfare system involvement as a child, 43%. Similarly, the child welfare system, many people said, this isn't necessarily something that can be saved at this point. It needs to be completely rethought how we offer children care, because there's so much discrimination and harm that people were reporting. 56% of gender diverse participants reported encounters with the criminal justice system. And so when we moved into looking at the literature broadly, we saw that there was literature and data, and also community folks were telling us that there is a lot of issues that start even for those who are experiencing housing precarity, sometimes well before. There are things that are happening where we could be acting, but we know that also access to education, access to healthcare, access to mental health care, access to legal support can be a protective factor for housing. So if we make sure that's happening, it's not unrelated to housing, it's actually providing a pathway to ensuring that someone feels safe and stable in their housing. So we know that trans students increasingly in particular provinces face discrimination and verbal and physical violence in everyday school life. And that those who are navigating intersecting discrimination, so for example, transphobia, homophobia, and racism, are more likely to be pushed out. I don't like saying drop out, because I think that it's actually more of a pushing out, and they face violence in school settings. And so we know that when you are disconnected from school, that becomes a cycle that can often really lead to more instability. Criminal legal systems and prisons are also particularly violent to gender diverse people, again, in part because of the binary, but also because of other forms of violence and discrimination, as are intersections with the immigration system, especially for refugees. This was something that came up in our discussions. Gender diverse individuals who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color are more likely to face a lack of access, discrimination, and harm in the healthcare system. And over half of gender diverse people reported avoiding healthcare systems entirely. So I'm not going to go to the doctor because I already know that that doctor is going to discriminate against me and not understand my unique needs as someone who's gender diverse. And so this was something that really grounded what we were looking at. And so the last few things I want to share come from this zine. It's a lot of text. If you want a copy, you can email me, but we'll be launching it soon. It was an amazing team. And based on all of this literature, we sat down and said, from those of us who had these diverse perspectives on this issue, like, what do we want people to know? And so some of the things that came out were the need to be understanding the unique intersections that Two-Spirit people are navigating within a settler colonial Canadian context. And so the page on the right is looking at the historic role of Two-Spirit people, and that this isn't something new. It's not like all of a sudden people are gender diverse, but this is actually something historic and often in some communities, in many communities, spiritual. And so we wanted to highlight the role of the Canadian state and settler colonialism in erasing some of that, and offer some tips. So throughout this zine, we have things like, making sure you're resourcing and funding Two-Spirit people and communities through the work. We saw in the research that communities of gender diverse people, Two-Spirit folks, trans folks, who are doing this work are often the least resourced. They're working on shoestring budgets to try to keep people alive and keep people housed. And so not having them have to constantly be fighting for funding was something that came up. And also understanding the disconnect between settler colonial ways of being annoying and the Indigenous ways of being annoying. And so that's something that's already come up today that I'm sure you'll be discussing. But the biggest one was the need to build connection and actual relationships with people of trust, so that people know that they can come to you or know that they can go to a particular community space and that it'll be safe for them and that they have a relationship there, that it isn't just kind of a unidirectional charity model, but it is something built in community and trust, and that people can build alternatives together. And the other piece that the team highlighted was that queer and gender diverse people have been taking care of each other's housing for a long time in the absence of state systems. And so that this also has to be recognized as resistance, and that we didn't want to undermine the activism that's gone into navigating housing rights for these communities. And so funding, support, allyship, all of these came up a lot in this project. And the final thing that I want to highlight, as I do with all of my work, is that lived experience and community knowledge is such an important place to be leading this work. And so the team really thought hard on what kinds of tips we wanted to give folks who don't have lived experience but might want to be highlighting it. Meeting people where they're at, knowing that they might have a whole lifetime of fighting systems that is exhausting. And so making sure that you're letting people come in the ways that they need to, emphasizing, acknowledging, and fostering solidarity and transformation, that we're not just trying to make little changes, but we're trying to transform a system, making sure that we're not putting to the side Two-Spirit needs and histories, and grounding that work in Two-Spirit leaders and advocates and Indigenous queer leaders and advocates, and ensuring that there's adequate education was by and large the biggest thing, making sure people have the tools they need to know how to interact with these issues, even if they might not be 100% there already. But if they're being asked to take on this work, that we're making sure that they're resourced, that they're educated, that they have everything they need, and that that's not a one-off training, that it's this ongoing learning together of how to be doing this work well. And so if you want an early copy of the zine, you can email me at jane.malafont@mcgill.ca. If you have any questions about any of this, I'm always really excited to talk about it, either, Two-Spirit, trans, gender diverse, housing rights in general, lived experience, leadership. This is all what I'm passionate about, and I'm really excited to be sharing it today. And I'm really excited to hear the other pieces that are going to be brought in. And yeah, I think that's about it from me. Thank you so much for inviting me, and it's so great to see folks from my home here.
I always go before being unmuted. I'm so sorry. I just wanted to thank you, Jane, for such an incredible presentation. Very exciting. I want to introduce Barbara Chizzy. Barbara is the assistant professor at the Toronto Metropolitan University and member of the Young Parents No Fixed Address group. Barbara holds a PhD in nursing from the University of Toronto and completed her Master's of Nursing Health in the Community Stream with a collaborative specialization in community development at the University of Toronto and a Bachelor of Nursing at the University of Manitoba. Barbara has a diverse clinical background that has spanned acute care, primary care, and home care, nursing within Canada and Asia. For her doctoral research, Barbara conducted a pilot randomized controlled trial to examine the feasibility and acceptability of a mobile phone-based peer support intervention for adolescent mothers. Her current research is focused on homelessness and food insecurity during pregnancy using a gender-based analysis approach. And she is dedicated to pursuing research and community partnerships that address the social determinants of health for vulnerable perinatal populations, including women and gender diverse people. She is appointed to the Yates School of Graduate Studies and is able to supervise and sit on thesis committees for graduate students. Thank you so much, Barbara. We're looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm just going to check if everybody can see my screen okay. Is that okay? And can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. So it's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much. This is a wonderful forum and a wonderful group of speakers. It's just an honor to be here today. And thank you very much for the intro. In terms of my migration from doing my PhD work with, it was really focused on postpartum depression. A lot of the people that I was seeing in my research were facing homelessness, and I felt like there was not a lot that could be done in terms of preventing postpartum depression or preventing some of the things that pregnant people are going through without addressing their housing needs. So all of my research, actually, since I finished my PhD, has been focused on homelessness, specifically during pregnancy. And it's just a pleasure today to be here. So I'm going to be talking to you today about a symposium that was held last year, exactly 1 year ago, on June the 8th, 2003. And this was a funded symposium from a connection grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And the co-investigators for that symposium and that grant was Sapali Garuge from the School of Nursing at Toronto Metropolitan University, Dr. Caitlin Schwan who was at the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network at the time, as well as my collaborators from the community, which is called the Young Parents No Fixed Address Network. And I'll be giving some information about YPNFA in just a minute. So it's a pleasure to be here today. I'll just let you know, I'm calling in from Toronto, but unfortunately I'm not able to be there in person today. But I'm very honored to be on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. And it's a pleasure to be able to work, live, and play here on this land. So this is some information about my community collaborator that I've been working with for over 15 years, called the Young Parents No Fixed Address Network. So this is a network of over 30 different agencies and organizations in Toronto. It started in 1997 by Toronto Public Health, and it was convened following the death of an infant in a shelter to a 19-year-old mother. And the premise of that death was to say that there was a lack of interprofessional collaboration, a lack of responsibility of care for that mother and that infant. And so they wanted to have a network that would be able to provide strong interprofessional collaboration. And this network.
Sorry, Barbara, can you hear me? Sorry to interrupt you. We can't actually see your screen. You're not in presenter mode.
Oh, okay. Hang on just a second. Let me.
So we could see your screen, just your slides weren't in presenter mode.
Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so I guess was it just on my first screen before that you were seeing?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So yeah, the last screen I had was the land acknowledgement, and then now this screen here. So this the YPNFA network, we meet once a month, every month, in order to be able to talk about issues that are facing anybody who's facing housing precarity in Toronto. And it's not just for young parents. And so we have the definition of young parents being anywhere up to 29. And we know that a lot of policies that are made, they might have very, very strict labels in terms of, what are the ages for be able to have somebody admitted to an agency or to be able to provide services from an agency. And so a lot of these community collaborators are, they realize that there's going to be a lot of leeway in terms of those age requirements. And so some of the examples of the collaborators we have in our network, we have the Toronto Public Health and Nurses from a Homelessness at Risk prenatal program. We have young parent agencies, we have children's aid societies, we have young parent organizations that are providing housing as well as resources. We have community housing programs. We also have some academics that have been sitting on the network. And I started on this network with a research project before my PhD even. And I was so inspired by the passion and dedication by this group that I just stayed with them throughout when I was doing recruitment for my PhD. But now I've been doing a lot of advocacy work and subcommittee work with the group. So they're an incredible agency. I'm really proud to be involved with them. So I'll give you a little bit of background about the issue of homelessness during pregnancy. I'm not going to give you a lot of information, but just some high-level background information. So in Toronto, there's approximately 300 children that are being born into homelessness every year. And this is data that's actually collected from the YPNFA network using a unique data collection method that was conducted by Toronto Public Health. And the Ontario government has just recently started collecting data and recognizes that their stats that they had for Toronto, which represented approximately 7 births into homelessness per year, was vastly different than the stats that we were collecting on our network. And so we spoke before about the invisibility of a problem or visibility of issues and of certain groups. And this is certainly the case when it comes to pregnancy during homelessness. So during a study that was conducted during COVID, I conducted a qualitative study with 25 women and gender diverse people in Toronto during the first 8 months of COVID. And what I really saw during that study is a real need for frequent relocation during pregnancy. And a lot of times this was because some of the shelters allowed somebody who may be pregnant up to a certain age, but then they had to be transferred to another shelter after the pregnancy. And at the time during COVID, some people were not wanting to go into shelters. They felt there was a lot of risks in shelters. But what, in terms of some stats that came out of that study, was that out of the 25 women, within an 8-month period, those women and gender diverse people had moved anywhere between 2 to 7 times within the 8 months. So one participant was moving almost every single month. And that could have been from anywhere from being completely unsheltered on the street to being staying with a friend. Some of them were resorting to staying in very precarious and unsafe conditions with people that they didn't really know. Some of them were then going to shelters or then to a different shelter. And then the average number of moves for all of these participants was 3.4 times within the 8-month period. So it really just goes to show you that there's no stability for housing during that pregnancy period. And some of the other things that have already been mentioned already is that there are long-standing heteronormative patriarchal approaches to service provision in Canada. For people who are pregnant particularly, they have a real fear of child apprehension, and they're not going to be divulging information necessarily about their housing status when they're in a hospital or when they're seeking services, because they might be afraid, or maybe they've had a prior child that was apprehended into child services. And so they're very fearful. And we also know that emergency shelters that are providing shelter, they can be very stifling, very oppressive. There's a lot of surveillance that's being done, a lot of expectations in terms of programming. And so that can be a real challenge as well. So the way I've looked at my research is very in tune to the Women's Housing and Homelessness Network in terms of using a gender-based analysis approach, and knowing that the experiences of homelessness for women and gender diverse people are very different and distinct from men. So in consultation with the Young Parents No Fixed Address Network, we started a subcommittee just prior to the pandemic in January 2020, that was focused on trying to address the housing crisis during pregnancy that we were seeing, that there was just this lack of housing and lack of suitable and safe housing. And we started a subcommittee called PATHS, and that stands for Providers Advocating Towards Housing Sustainability. So this was a group of midwives, community service providers, public health representatives, and as well as myself from academia, that came together to try to say, okay, what are things that we can do to provide some advocacy to be able to create awareness about this issue. And so we felt that there was a need to be able to create awareness. And so one of the things we discussed was having a symposium where we could bring people together. And the aim of what we're trying to do is address siloed policies within the shelter, as well as fragmented social services that are causing barriers to accessing these essential prenatal and postpartum support. So we felt that there was a vital need to exchange knowledge between key partners. And so these are the first and foremost experts and people with lived experience, as well as service providers, researchers, and policymakers, and bringing them all together to have a conversation together. So on June 8th, 2023, we held a symposium for one day in Toronto. These pictures that you see on the slides are all taken from the symposium or from the work from the Young Parents No Fixed Address Network. And it's all been taken with permission to be able to use these within presentations. So you can see that there were a diverse group of people. It was over 60 people that were brought together. We had quite equal representation of people with lived experience. Our community partners, we were very, very careful as to how we were including people with lived experience with their children. We had child support that was available. It was a very flexible type of day to provide safety, especially for the needs of the experts with lived experience. We had an Indigenous knowledge keeper there during the day. We had counselors that were available in case there was any experiences that were traumatizing or re-traumatizing at all. And so the day was separated into two different parts. So the morning consisted of some presentations. So we did have Caitlin Schwann was our first presenter in the morning. We also had Toronto Public Health speak about their data collection of pregnancy during homelessness. I gave an overview of some of the research I had conducted during COVID, as well as the YWCA in Hamilton that we made a collaboration with to talk about their work that they're doing in Hamilton. We then had a panel presentation between service providers and people with lived experience. And that's the picture you can see at the very top with the people sitting in the chairs at the very, very top. And they were giving their experiences of how they have seen the system and what has worked and what has not really worked for them. The bottom pictures, you'll see the bottom left-hand picture is everybody who attended the symposium. And on the bottom right-hand side, you'll see that there was a lot of collaborative dialogue in the afternoon. We held what was called a World Cafe. And the World Cafe had groups of people that were assigned to tables to talk about two key issues. And so the first issue was about talking about the barriers and the to housing during pregnancy, specifically in Toronto, and to understand what some of those challenges are. And then the second part of the World Cafe was about looking at some recommendations, like what do they see could be some solutions going forward. And so it was a really good way to be able to have this dialogue between those policymakers that were very much focused on at the City of Toronto, the housing departments, and to be able to hear the voices of service providers and people with lived experience. So one of the things that we did at the symposium was premiered a video that was made by the PATH subcommittee that I talked about earlier. So these are some images that are taken, they're just screenshots taken from the video. If you are interested in watching this advocacy video, there is only music in the background, and it's meant to tell the story of a hero's journey. And so if you would like to watch the video, it's on YouTube. You just have to Google A Path to Safety on YouTube. And it was made in collaboration with the midwifery department at the South Riverdale Community Health Center in Toronto, and they are providing services a lot to marginalized groups of women and gender diverse people in Toronto. And so the funding came partially from the South Riverdale Community Health Center and partially from a research grant that I was holding at Toronto Metropolitan University. And so these are some of the data that was put in was the data about the 300 babies are born into people experiencing homelessness in Toronto. And we're hoping that this video, which will be able to be showcased widely, will be creating some awareness about this issue. So what were some of the findings that we had from the symposium? So things that a lot of you probably are already aware of and you probably know of in terms of having siloed care and one service not talking to another service and not being able to cross services or cross references between each other. There's inflexibility of services. A lot of people with lived experience are having confusion navigating the shelter system and knowing where to access services and how to access services. And a lot of times when people are accessing the shelters in pregnancy, that they might be arriving in a shelter that is completely unsuitable for somebody who's pregnant. You know, there's people who are 8 months pregnant and they are going to a co-ed shelter and they're given a cot on the ground and having to stay there for the night, and they can't even get down onto the cot at all because they're not able to move down to the ground that easily. So, you know, they'll sleep on a chair, and then the next day the shelter will try to find somewhere else for them to go. And so there's a lot of confusion as to how they're getting to the shelter system. And a lot of times people are accessing the shelter system by just asking a taxi driver to take them to a near shelter. Either they might be arriving in Toronto at the airport, or they're arriving into Toronto from another city, and they don't know where to go. So they're asking taxi drivers to take them, and the taxi drivers don't really know where to go and where to take them. So they just take them to a local shelter, which is not necessarily the most suitable place. So the other thing we find is that there's a lot of perpetuation of trauma and re-traumatization at any of the services that are being provided. There's barriers to exiting homelessness, and there's also a lack of personal skills related to self-advocacy that participants have noted. And some of the recommendations that came through was increasing integrated care, as well as increased intersectoral collaboration and more conversations between service providers. Also, having more trauma-informed service provision and having education for service providers so they know how to provide trauma-informed care. Because a lot of times, a lot of service providers, they don't necessarily have the most recent training or understanding as to what that means exactly. We need to develop strategies to be able to exit homelessness. We need to have more affordable and supportive housing available to people. We need to decrease some of those barriers to exiting homelessness, and even looking at further research is needed, like, for example, street needs assessment and enumeration. So in terms of next steps, so this is something very new that we just found out that we're going to be conducting. We've received funding for a multi-site study between Toronto, Hamilton, and London, Ontario. And this is going to be trying to really uncover and make visible some of the extent and the nature of this issue of homelessness during pregnancy. So the first thing we're going to do, and we're just starting this just right now, just this month, is looking at the Better Outcomes and Registry Network Birth Registry. So that's from the province of Ontario. And these were the ones was the network that only was capturing 7 births per year in Toronto. And they're now more online in terms of their data collection with what we're doing with our birth count at the Young Parents No Fixed Address Network. So we're going to be going through their data and trying to understand their data and how they capture their data to be able to try to understand and assess that true scope of the problem. We're then going to have focus groups with service providers who are working with these homeless pregnant women and gender diverse people. And we're going to be asking them, like, what types of people might be missed in that database, and be able to identify relevant variables that, you know, might be able to help us understand hidden homelessness better. And then we're going to have individual interviews with people with lived experience to get their feedback and information and help clarify what supports and services that they need. So this is just a bit of a background about pregnancy during homelessness. We really want to call attention to this being a priority population in terms of women and gender diverse people who are facing housing insecurity. And I'm happy to stay after and answer any questions that you might have. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk today.
Thank you so very much, Barbara. Now I'm going to invite Cheryl Case to present. Cheryl is the founder and executive director of CP Planning, a Toronto-based nonprofit organization defining the practice of a human rights-based approach to urban planning. Her passion is to help diverse stakeholders understand, align.
Hi, Cheryl.
I'm just checking to see if someone has their mic on.
Hello? Cheryl is here in person.
All right.
Can folks
Thank
see me?
you.
Yep. Online? The camera's gonna come, yes.
Okay, I'll just finish introducing Cheryl. I'm hoping everyone heard what I've said already, but Cheryl's passion is to help diverse stakeholders understand, align, and direct their investments into solutions that uphold the economic, social, and cultural rights of marginalized people to have access to good housing, good jobs, an adequate standard of living, and opportunities for cultural expression. Doing so requires breaking down barriers and fostering collaborative relationships between stakeholders who may have previously thought themselves to be at opposite ends of the question. By the 6th year of her professional practice, Cheryl's talents in program development and management raised and coordinated hundreds of thousands of dollars in support of community development in Little Jamaica, Toronto, and millions for community development across central southern Ontario to alleviate poverty and build systems for increasing affordable housing supply. Thanks for being with us, Cheryl, and take it away. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me to be here. So I was going to disclose first and foremost, I do not have a presentation prepared. I'm going to be just kind of going off. I've been having a bit of a difficult week, and so I didn't get my presentation together, but I've talked about my work well enough and enough times I should be able to kind of go off the cuff and share about the work that we do as city planning. So we were founded 2017, and this was just based off the idea of, what would neighborhoods look like if housing was a human right. This was the first project that we ever did. It was called Housing in Focus, actually incorporated city planning specifically so I can apply for funding to do this project. In my university, we learned about the intersection of human rights and housing and urban planning. And I wanted to go out and test out the theory of, well, we apply these human rights principles to the planning process, what would we get as an outcome? And when I first had this idea of doing that work, my idea was to talk to local residents and ask them about their stories and package those stories and hand them off to city administrators, hoping that the stories of their poverty would move these city administrators to be more proactive and ambitious with their approach to addressing the housing crisis. When I spoke to the people who are marginalized or those who work on behalf of marginalized communities, I was really surprised to hear that they actually wanted me to go a step further from telling their stories. They actually wanted me to help them to build out in more real terms, what would the neighborhood look like? So doing actual drawings of their neighborhoods, setting aside what their beliefs are regarding policies. So we went through a really fun co-design process where we co-developed the project. And so I think at the age of 22, I was able to secure partnerships with about 5 neighborhoods in the city of Toronto: Scarborough, Weston, Etobicoke Lakeshore, Parkdale, and Danforth, Maine, to engage over 140 residents, which included also the fact that we needed about 20 volunteers. Over 160 people were involved in this exploration of what would neighborhoods look like if housing was a human right. And what was very surprising was how different those maps looked like in comparison to what the traditional planning process generates. And so you had this process which is grounded in human rights, so meaning that the people who were engaged were those who were marginalized. We had people who were on limited income. We had single parent mothers who were there. A lot of people who I partnered with that ended up being women. Of course, we know that women are very engaged in this this work to address the housing crisis. And we also had a lot of allies who themselves are housed, but then wanted to support their neighbors to also have that same security. And in this process, we saw a lot of demand for co-op housing. So this was different in that in traditional planning processes, you don't actually have any zonings for the land use. You just have simply enough. Well, how tall can the land governance of that land? Sorry, that co-op is a model of governing the land. Traditional planning, you'll have the land use. So is it housing? Is it mixed use? But when you engage communities in human rights perspective, they actually want to talk about the governance of the land, which is really surprising. And co-ops is a very community-centered model where communities actually have a voice in how the land is managed, as opposed to, when you're renting, which is actually the most precarious and form of accessing land for those who are lower income. And so in addition to the support for more co-op housing, there was also support for a lot more density. And so the density part was really interesting Anyone here from the term NIMBY? NIMBY, yeah, okay, so a lot of people nodding their heads. So NIMBY is a term that's used to refer to someone who is anti-development. They don't want to see any changes in their neighborhood. But so this cohort of people have actually been able to take on representation for the community in terms of, well, the community says we don't want development because I'm coming to this meeting and I say I don't want development. But I found, well, when you engage marginalized communities and their allies, they support development because they know that it's needed to actually meet the housing supply, right? We know that in most of Canada and many other cities as well, the development of new housing is not meeting the demand for new development, right? We're seeing a lot of people in rooming houses, students in very unsafe housing situations, people having to sleep on couches and rent couches for $300 a month. I hear in Etobicoke is a recent thing that's going on there. And so, you know, this title of so this role that the people who are against development have in the planning process is actually one that has been steeped in the tradition of planning from the very earliest stages of its development. And I can tell you that because I've done the research. So going back to 1904 was when the first permit was filed to build an apartment building in the city of Toronto. In that same year, and the apartment building at the time, just to be clear, was very short development. It was about 4 stories tall. But at the time, this was seen as an abomination to a certain segment of the population who were so moved that they actually wrote an article in the Canadian Architecture and Builders magazine stating that apartment building will lead to women no longer having care and homekeeping or raising a family. And so what is it that the apartment did that was such an affront to the idea of what it means to be a woman? Well, at the time, women were seeking more independence, and in order to be more independent, you'd have to have, you know, housing is a key fundamental component of that, right? And so before apartment buildings, to be able to live outside of your family, you know, of your parents, you'd have to, one, either get married, right? So you're going to have to be then submitting to somebody else, or you'd have to be a housemaid, right? Because a lot of the housing was just single family housing. This is the only way you can get into housing. And apartment buildings led to women being able to have independence to choose when they would marry or to be able to do housemaid, but not as a live-in servant, but actually having that independence as well. And so that's in the very early stages of development in Toronto. There's very similar stories that happened in other cities as well, but I'm going to focus on Toronto today. And so that happened in 1904, and you can see that having an impact in terms of pushing back against single family housing. And then you go into the 1940s and 1960s, you're seeing that kind of dialogue still going on. It was in the 1940s when the first single family exclusive neighborhood was built in the city of Toronto. And we found that in that neighborhood, they had fewer single women than other parts of the city that had more diverse housing. In the 1960s is when in the town of Weston, which is a neighborhood just at the Weston and Lawrence intersection in Toronto, about maybe 45 minutes from where we are standing right now. And there was a part that at the time they were, the government was allowed to do zoning for families. So the land was zoned for families, and that directly impacted women because, you know, women as today are making less for the same work, and even more so that, of course, there's an article that was published about 4 career girls, 4 grown women who were working. One of them was a teacher who was living on land that was zoned for families together, right? They were co-tenants to this property, and they were fined by the city for living on that land because they were not supposed to be living there. And so thankfully enough, one of these women were very resilient, and they actually fought this terrible zoning bylaw, and were actually able to have it overturned. Barbara Green was her name, and she actually ran and became a local councillor, and local actually, as she ran for to become an MPP as well, and was able to overturn that policy so that it would never be possible again to zone for families. But we still see that happening today with the prevention of rooming houses, and also the lack of affordable housing being developed, right? So this is the framework that we're building within in order to address the housing crisis, one that has been built fundamentally to limit the freedoms of women. And it's not something that is a new thing to come into consideration. Actually, when I was doing my research for the Housing in Focus study, I looked and I found that in the 40s and 50s, no, it was in the 60s when, after they've been building some single family exclusive neighborhoods, they found that this new housing model was actually leading to women having lesser opportunities to, if they were to be divorced, to be able to stay in a neighborhood with their children and go to the same school and maintain their social network. So this was something that we've known about for decades. The way that we plan and decide how land is used impacts women's freedoms. And so, you know, what I encourage in this conversation around addressing the barriers that women face is that through this human rights lens, we can see that there's three distinct types of discrimination. There's systemic discrimination, which is where, you know, this history is not even able to be acknowledged, and the fact that we're not dealing with a neutral system. It's a very intentional system, and so having that awareness, and then also the fact of, in order to address systemic discrimination, you need to be able to support those who are willing to acknowledge, but then also to build solutions and to directly address the issues at hand. And so I'm really glad that the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network and the Indigenous Network is also here to bring direct attention to these matters at the United Nations. That the UN Habitat is also here, as well as the many great partners who are working to bring these issues to the forefront. So the second layer of discrimination would be indirect discrimination. And so this is where it is more difficult to do desirable and human rights aligned solutions than it is to do solutions that are actually going to be harming people, right? So we look at the development approvals process. I mentioned that, you know, we don't have enough development being conducted in order to meet the demand for new housing. And so this is where we find that, you know, in order to get the funding to develop housing, right? It's very easy. It's much easier to build market housing than it is to build non-market housing, right? And so the lack of subsidy into nonprofit housing, the lack of skills development into nonprofit housing, and the lack of community organizing to really be able to focus on these issues are some really key markers of indirect discrimination within our housing ecosystem. And so this is why CB planning exists, is to address this layer of discrimination where people are not even able to direct their attention towards the key matters that are so important, right? We look at the economy, for example, when it comes to developing, not only is it that there is difficulty in securing funding to build, there's also a difficulty in securing the labor resources to organize and to assemble around land. And so that's, to give even more granular, that's really the target market that we're looking at addressing at city planning, and we're really pleased to work with a great number of partners who are doing this work as well. So in the city of Toronto, we've done work in Little Jamaica, which is a neighborhood at the Eglinton and Keele area up towards Allen, supporting community groups there to organize and to find land that can be developed. We also supported in Lakeshore and in Ottawa, in Peel region and in Hamilton, support community groups to identify land and then to later invest in to support investment into that land to build new affordable housing. And so we hope that by supporting more people to develop the skills and being able to identify land for development and to move development through the pipeline, and then to also identify the policies that need to be changed in order to make this easier, right? To invest in more community-led planning, we'll be able to shift the system, because without economic solutions, we won't be able to get to that key system where this is actually able to happen in a natural format, where housing is being built in abundance as it is needed to be. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Cheryl. Now I'd like to introduce Doug, and he has to leave us fairly soon, so I'm sorry for rushing. Anyway, I'll introduce Doug. He's an accomplished professional with a wealth of management experience in city and UN agency settings. His career has been dedicated to driving performative change and empowering diverse communities through sustainable urban development initiatives. As a program management officer at UN Habitat for 13 years, Doug has successfully led key initiatives that have not only have had impact at the local, national, and global level. At the heart of his work is a passion for community engagement and social inclusion. By championing community engagement and local governance, Doug has had a significant impact in hundreds of communities worldwide. He takes a holistic approach, recognizing that sustainable urban development requires collaborative efforts at all levels, from grassroots action to global decision-making and policy-making. Thank you so much, Doug.
Thanks. Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here. Yeah, I do have a bit of a tight schedule, but I will definitely give it my best. So yeah, my name is Doug Reagan. I work with UN Habitat, based out of Nairobi, Kenya. Interesting, my specialty is not in gender, but more in children and youth. But when you're talking about Africa or in many of the developing world, children and youth make up 70+% of the population. So kind of speaking one and the same. So let me just throw up my presentation. That may be desktop. And PowerPoint. And there we go. So yes, basically what I'd like to present on, and it's based on a report that I can't actually post the file in the chat, but I will send to the coordinator, send to Alex to send out, that we've done a while back on a program we call the Slum Upgrading Program, which is basically looking at how we look at informality and such. I will two things I'd like to just quickly point out in terms of language. We use the word slums and informal settlements. I know slum. I'm also Canadian. I'm from Vancouver, where I'm currently at, actually. I know slums, it sometimes makes people cringe in the developed world, but this is the language that is used in much of the world. We can also say informal settlements, but again, that sounds more bureaucratic. But basically, slums is the language, so apologies for that. In terms of the presentation, housing challenges for women and gender diverse peoples, I want to just be, for full disclosure, the UN is trying to address the issues of gender diversity. And, you know, this is a big part of my job, actually, in the work working in what we call the Human Rights and Social Inclusion Unit. I wouldn't say it's necessarily doing the best job. So, I mean, this is principally on women, so that we might have some reference to gender diverse people as well, but it's something that we have to definitely work on within the UN system. So yeah, I'm looking at slums and informal settlements. I am, and so again, slums as they stand, for example, in the Nairobi, Kenya, where I live, the slums make up 60% or 60% of the population in Nairobi lives in informal settlements. Informal settlements make up 5% of the land base, so incredibly dense, vast majority of people, and that's pretty indicative of anything in Africa. Latin America has a bit different statistics, and Asia as well. But in the developing world, the majority of people in urban situations live either near or in informal settlements. Okay, why is it not going next? So the global context, millions of men and women live in urban areas without secure tenure. So again, this is secure tenure and adequate housing. So this, of course, makes life extremely difficult. It means that you can be easily and rapidly kicked out of your home. This is what we've seen, and I'll go into it a bit deeper. If you've been watching the news about some of the flooding going on in Kenya, and specifically an informal settlement that I work very closely with called Mathari, there's been massive dislocation, massive amount of people kicked out of their homes, which I'll go into a bit more. In gender disparities, women and gender diverse individuals definitely face greater housing insecurity, just because it's much harder for women to hold tenure. It's often very traditional systems where the male of the household holds tenure. And women and gender individuals also participate less in decision making, limited access to access and assets, and general systemic discrimination. Sorry, I keep getting something popping up in my. Okay, that's not what we're doing. What are we doing here? Disproportionate impact, again, yeah, low income, especially if you're a low income person living so if you're again looking at a Nairobi, Kenya example, the vast majority, the 60% of the population probably makes in a range of $10 to $20 a day. And that's usually fair. There's no backstopping, there's no social security system really to speak of, or health system. So again, it makes us women and gender diverse individuals quite at risk. So what we're trying to do is the kind of the strategy of the program that called our Slum Upgrading Program is, again, mainstreaming. So we're trying to make sure that all policies and act processes are gender and gender sensitive. So that's in design, implementation, evaluation of housing projects, who's it built for, how is it financed, the whole range of that. And that's, I mean, obviously we're the UN. I mean, this is not, I've seen the presentations here have been really excellent, and they've been very detailed about specific detailed programs. This is a broader perspective of more of an aggregate of what we've learned in global policy. We also try to, again, take into account the diversity of gender and gender diverse peoples, looking at all the different challenges they may face, and looking at it from a more holistic perspective. Some of the approaches we do, and these could in themselves take full presentations. We look at what we call the people's process, which is basically a participatory process from the bottom, all the way from the bottom up. The biggest challenge we're faced with we're living in an informal settlement anywhere in Africa, Latin America, is that oftentimes the governance systems aren't there to plug into. And sometimes where they're at is they are traditional systems blended with local government, blended with national government systems. So you really need to, it's a long and winding path. It's a little bit more, in my experience, I've worked 20 plus years in the downtown east side of Vancouver, working with many of the communities there. There is at least some formal structure, though the formal structure is often biased and exclusionary. In this situation, the informality means that you don't even know what the process is. So we really try to increase the capacity. We really see that one of the major solutions is increasing the capacity of civil society groups, and that's much what I do. Much of the work I have is on youth, women-led groups, and how I can make those groups do what they do better, no matter where they're focused. Post-disaster recovery, number 2 in this, is critical and is, again, in informal situations, it hits these communities incredibly hard. So usually, for example, fires, whether they're man-made or whether they happen for many of the reasons, could be electrical or whatever, the ability to have any resilience around post-disaster is critical. Now, again, if you look at, a whole other presentation I could make on what's going on in the informal settlements in Nairobi right now, where the disaster was a climate disaster, where we had more rain in 1 week in Nairobi than we had for the full year previously, which has wiped out infrastructure, which flooded out and displaced thousands of people. But the challenge is that what's happened is the government, in the next step, has taken the next step of using that as an excuse to clear what they're calling the riparian zones along all the rivers which flooded. So the 30 to 60 meter setback. And this is now, but now looks like what they're trying to do is eradicate the slums. So not the climate disaster was one disaster. Now we're into humanitarian disaster, basically caused by the government. So it's it's quite dramatic. And then inclusive participatory processes, again, is the same as the people's process. Am I still on? Why is Alex pinging me? Anyways, sorry. Gender sensitive policies and indicators for accountability. Again, I will go quickly through this. We really try to make inclusive national and local policies. The other big thing is that you need data, and that's a problem in informal settlements. So we do a lot of training in participatory data collection, specifically geospatial data collection. Geospatial because we don't have any data on where they're at. And if you don't have data, you don't know who's there and how can you make policies. So we do a lot of training on that. Geospatial, because informal settlements, as by the definition, means it's completely informal. You have no idea really who lives there. There's no houses, there's no housing addresses and such. So there's a lot of, but with AI and with participatory research technologies that we're using now, this has changed dramatically in the last 2 years. So to the point now where we can train much easier young people from informal settlements with many different levels of education, and especially women's groups, but also youth groups. Quick case study, and again, I would much rather have someone else present this who is from this community, but this just kind of gives you an idea of how we've worked with groups. So it was a case study in Namibia, in Windhoek. Samstan is a cooperative. The first thing they did is land acquisition. They registered an organization, and this is something we suggest to all groups that we've ever worked with. And actually, when I worked in Canada, the same. And then they established a group, increased their capacity. Next, they went through and purchased land through a revolving fund. In Kenya, it's actually called a merry-go-round, because the fund services each person as it goes around. Then we had sustainable practices, participatory decision-making, community planning. Again, all the stuff that we've seen presented here, again, is what we're trying to do there. We collaborated with Missouri Windhoek. Windhoek is the capital in Namibia. Adopted innovative, cost-effective strategies. And then the output, empowerment of women, and women form the majority of the cooperative, managed group loan schemes, and fostered a spirit of collaboration. Outcome seems to have got cut off, but I mean, those are kind of the outcomes as well. So again, just to reiterate, collaborative efforts, big for us is training and awareness with NGO, civil society groups, for women, and again, youth. Empower women and gender diverse people, again, trying to make sure that those NGOs that are created that we're supporting are very inclusive. It's not always, I mean, the challenge again around the role of women, and even more so around the role of gender diverse people, is that the definition, if sometimes there isn't one, in many of the countries, is not what we would call something that we'd hold to standard in a Canadian context. So it's quite complicated, but it's also complicated as well, is that there's just different cultural norms about where people's roles are, and it'd be much better to have someone in like a Kenyan researcher to come in and represent how this works in different communities. I'm not trying to say the Canadian context is any better than others, but there's just incredibly complex ways that people are engaged and not. Again, I was just mentioning informal settlements. This slide should have gone a bit earlier, actually. It's like, again, definition, high population density. Like we're talking 50,000 people per square kilometer in Mathare, where I work. Women's vulnerability, I mean, low-income women especially are, I mean, really horrible issues in the area of physical violence and such. And when disaster happens, they're the most disproportionately impacted. And then what do you do with informal settlements? So this is a whole other presentation of how you try to eradicate them, which is what's happening now, which is massive gentrification, honestly, or do you try to upgrade them? But it's also, when you upgrade, you move, what do you do with the people already living there, and how do you upgrade that? It's very complex. And then just our solutions at the end, again, gender mainstreaming, making sure that all of our policies are responsive and that they're really analyzed. empowering communities, a community-based approach. I mean, again, this is both in a Canadian, my experience in Canada, specifically working with youth in the downtown east side, but again, in the African context or any other developing world context, is that civil society is critical and the role of civil society is critical. And then strengthening partnerships. As much as we'd like, it's interesting coming from a civil society perspective into a UN perspective, which is very different levels, different lanes, if you want to call them that. I mean, I am a passionate believer in civil society, but there's also limitations to civil society. Governance is also important and you can't ignore it. Local governments is critical. We call it localization from our agency, where people engage directly with local government, and that's where the closest level of government to them. But then they also need to engage in national level as well as international level. So they have to deal with all that and the partnerships within those and establishing the partnerships, even with partners you may not necessarily trust, but you need to have them on board because you're not going to get anywhere without them. So that would be the presentation. So thank you so much, and happy if anyone wants to put any questions in the chat, I'd be happy to answer them, or you can email me later on. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Doug. I'm kind of taking over for Arlene. She had to hop off for a little bit. I'm going to move on to our next speaker who's joining us today. So Mariam, thank you so much for joining us, is a speaker who, Mariam, I'm so sorry. I don't think I have your bio. Can I hand it off to you to introduce yourself? I think I thought I
can
did, but just to
absolutely
be
do
incorrect.
that.
Thank you so much.
That's okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm joining today from the unceded territories of the Mohawk and the Anishinaabe peoples here in Montreal, Quebec. Khulud and I and Arlene have been together the last few years working on affordable housing all across Canada. So this is lovely to be back at the Urban Economy Forum this year. I am wearing many hats today. I am a senior fellow for social innovation at Social Innovation Canada, and that's the work I'm going to be presenting today. I also am on the tail end of finishing my PhD in decolonizing social innovation. So you're going to see some flavors of that in this presentation. And I work across different social impact organizations around justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility, around systems change, social finance, and how they relate to complex challenges like housing. So with that, I'm going to try and see if I can share my screen here. This is very strange. Something. For some reason, Khulud, this is not letting me share my screen. So if I give you my slides on chat, do you think you could open them?
I can totally share them for you.
And let me just change this. Oh yeah, I think you should be able to open this.
I think you just need to give me access, actually.
Okay, try again. Like just refresh because I just changed the settings.
Okay. Perfect. All right. I will have that going.
Thank you. And so the story I'm about to tell you today is around a housing lab that SI Canada ran with support from the CMHC on the financialization of housing. And we start with our core challenge. So that's the next slide, around how we don't have our most recent statistics. That's the starting point. But even in 2018, our latest statistics show that 1.6 million Canadians did not have a home that they could afford that meets their needs. And in this huge population, there's a significant subset of lone parent households, mostly single mother households, visible minorities who are mostly affected in a significant way, and 13.5% indigenous peoples, and then 16.6% sexual minorities. And so housing is clearly a gendered issue and an equity issue. And so to address this piece as part of our work on the financialization of housing, I'm going to tell you more about, for starters, the lab itself and the challenges, the way we frame the financialization of housing. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit more about a case study from Keeper to the Circle that centered gender needs and indigenous women in the housing sector and space. So in our next slide, we basically frame that, look, housing and housing affordability is a complex wicked problem. There are no silver bullet solutions. We need systems, all hands on deck approaches. And a social innovation lab is one way to do that, where you try and bring multiple stakeholders together from across the spectrum of the challenge, do a deeper sensing of the problem itself, and then try and figure out what parts of the problem can be addressed by which of our stakeholders. So from 2020 until 2023, we ran a social innovation lab on the financialization of housing. And if you go to the next slide, we can tell you a little bit more about, so we took a systems approach, we mapped, some of the key ways in which the housing affordability challenge was constantly repeating itself. This particular map shows you tenants at the center and their experience of housing inaffordability in Toronto. If you go to the next slide, here were some macro trends we were noticing. That mortgage and securitization rates at the time with falling interest were leading to this excessive demand, lots and lots of retail and institutional investors who were already in the rental markets, and then increasing house prices and household debt levels. And we're seeing that even now, like post-COVID, that all these things still are contributing to the mess that is the housing sector in Canada right now. If you go to the next slide, some of those initial stats again, 1.6 million people who are in core housing need. There is a long-term decline in purpose-built rental and social housing units, and more people have been ending up in the core housing needs spectrum. If you go further, the next slide. So here are the three ways in which we understood the financialization of housing. Firstly, we saw that there has been this growing deficit in below market affordable rental housing in Canada, and a third of Canadians are renters. We saw there is this increased risk and insecurity of tenure, right? Where there were so many no-fault evictions, personal use evictions, which doubled from 2015 to 2019. And a lot of renovictions where people were forced out of affordable units. Those units were renovated and then put on rent again for much higher rates that the original renters could not afford. And then on top of it, rising house prices kept increasing that gap between renters and owners. So there was a wealth gap that kept growing bigger and bigger and bigger to the point that renters cannot imagine ever owning a house. And so if you go to the next slide, we took a lab approach that looked at these challenges, and particularly some of these approaches looked at a very gendered specific approach. So we looked at community wealth building through affordable housing. Could there be a fund? Could there be a cluster of organizations coming together, leveraging things like community bonds and other financial tools that raise entire communities out of poverty through housing and affordable housing? There were discussions around levers and tools, particularly social finance tools, for small municipalities to cluster together and create more affordable housing, address some of the NIMBY problem one of our speakers was talking about earlier, which is a big thing in these small municipalities. And if we could somehow showcase to the NIMBYs that actually building more affordable housing and using social finance as a tool to do that might be great for the local economy and actually increase community wealth in the economy, in the small municipalities. We were also looking at what does it mean to partner with Black, Indigenous, racialized communities for sustainable construction, passive housing, addressing both the climate challenge and the housing challenge in a mix by partnering with Indigenous and racialized communities. And then we also explored the role of private developers and how they can help create healthy communities. We used the CMHC's own social finance models and see if that could be used to create more affordable housing for equity-seeking groups. And so if we go to the next slide, this prototyping phase brought together over 30 stakeholders. We had multiple plenary meetings and cluster groups. And each of these meant that the folks in these communities were going deep and partnering and sensing together with the folks directly in core housing need. And in this collaborative model, they were coming up with potential solutions, potential interventions that could then be tested against the challenges that we had mapped in our earlier discovery process in the Social Innovation Lab. If you go to the next slide, one of the ways in which we try to do this differently is not become very head-centric and try and be more relational, try and leave our technical knowledge out, because our technical knowledge only takes us so far, right? There are relational pieces that we aren't very aware of. There are community pieces that we often miss. And so we took a bit of an upside down approach, both in terms of the way we ran this lab and we built relationships across the stakeholders, but also the way we gave the tools for this kind of relation first approach to co-creation and prototyping to the teams that were working with us. So the next slide might take you there. Actually, we might want to skip to the last slide, Khulud, so slide 14. Yeah, so instead of talking about housing, we started by talking about home. So we said to folks, is it possible for us to not just look at housing as a thing? Because the minute we turn housing into a thing is when we start having these problems, right? We start looking at housing as an asset that can be financialized. And so everybody wants to own more and more and more. So if you start looking at housing not as an asset, but housing as home, housing as the key to belonging, how does that shift the way we think about housing, the way we build housing, the way we sell housing? And then leaving that technical expertise piece on the side for a second and really honing in on community expertise. And you're going to see that particularly in this case study. And starting off, instead of just speaking, just actually slowing down and breathing and sensing into what are the needs. So even in terms of a lab process, we didn't want to manage these folks, these stakeholders and their prototypes. We just wanted to facilitate, to give them what they needed in order to support the communities that they were working with. And so instead of being human-centered, we wanted them to be more regenerative, more in touch with what is the wider ecosystem within which these housing challenges exist? What are pieces outside and are other than human relatives on the Earth Mother as a living being? If that's the way you look at where we live and the way housing is built, then you need to think about it differently, right? And so from systems change, we were looking at relational systems thinking, that how do different parts of the system living created, human, other than human, how do these all sort of link together, and what are the relationships between these nested systems? And so instead of discussing or going on and debating and argumenting, how do we dance with systems? How do we be fluid with systems? And therefore move from a paradigm of owning a house to the paradigm of being in a home where you feel like you can belong. And so in this process, and maybe Khulud, what I can do is I can put this in the chat. It's a file. But I don't, let's see. So it's a file that are, there you go. Maybe you should be able to download this from the chat and just put it up on the screen. So this is the case study, is EcoBuild North. And I can tell you a bit of a backstory about it. So we met Khulud and her team as part of an Indigenous housing seminar that they were running back in 2021. And it felt immediately aligned with some of this work we were doing at the Housing Lab. And I said to Khulud, hey, is it possible for us to have you in this cluster of stakeholders and people who are trying to do something different? And Khulud and Arlene jumped right in. One of their teammates, Mike Degani, took over that piece. And together, they were able to co-create EcoBuild North, which is a social enterprise that centered the needs of women in Northern Ontario in the housing space. And so they were noticing a whole bunch of things around lack of housing, but also lack of very sort of land-based, needs-based housing, right? And so one of the things that they did was they sat with Indigenous grandmothers in Northern Ontario and said, you know, how do we actually build housing? How do we build home? And so in that process of building home, they came across so many things. They came across the idea that home cannot be just a building. It is a system. And so it became about food systems. It became about how to live in good relations. It became about how to construct well, and then how to maintain well. So EcoBuild North started off doing that sensing with the Indigenous communities in Northern Ontario, and essentially came up with a construction model that brought together net zero passive housing, modular housing models with Indigenous knowledge systems, matriarchal knowledge systems, and created a social enterprise that could create those passive houses in Northern Ontario. It then started by developing a curriculum and a training program whereby Indigenous women could both build, renovate, and maintain the housing that they were creating in the Northern communities. And then it looked at, could there be a wider sort of chain or production cycle set up where these women then become employed to do the same passive modular housing creation across Indigenous communities. So this is, and just one example of how lab approaches, but in particular relational approaches to the challenges, the complex challenges of housing can lead to completely different and innovative outcomes and center women and gender diverse people in doing that. So with that, I'm just going to wrap up, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much for all the very productive and informative speeches. We have gone over time, so we're not going to have the Q&A session, but we're going to have a quick 5-minute break just so everyone can stretch. And then we're going to come back into breakout sessions where we're going to begin talking about some transformative solutions to some of the crises that we've heard about in housing and the precarity of housing and homelessness. Thank you very much. We'll be back in 5 minutes. You know what? We could have one. Hello, everyone. Welcome back and thank you. We are now going into the last phase of today's event. We're going into breakout sessions. Each session is designed to foster an in-depth discussion, analysis, and development of innovative and transformative solutions. You will be provided with a series of questions. There's actually 2 tables here for in-person and 2 breakout sessions, and each one has a series of 3 or 4 questions for you to discuss and come up with some potential solutions. Okay, the outcomes of these breakout sessions will be integrated into a comprehensive report, and this report is going to be submitted to the 12th World Urban Forum, which is taking place in Cairo from November 4th to the 8th. Thank you very much, and yes, very good. What we are then going to come back, it's only going to be 30 minutes. We're going to then come back to the larger group, but what I'm going to ask you is if somebody can moderate or facilitate the discussion and someone else can be taking notes, and then if you can then elect someone to, when we come back to the larger group, to share your outcomes with the larger group. And then after that, it'll be closing remarks. So it's in 30 minutes, we'll come back into the group discussion. And if you need any assistance, I am here in person, and Alex, my colleague, is doing the virtual, and he can provide you with any assistance. Thank you. Okay. Here's one question. Table, and here's another. And the questions are here.
Type notice, if you haven't already, please accept to go into one of the breakout rooms. Or at this point, you can now choose to go.
Hi, we going to join the session. Okay. There's first table is the question on some academic issues and solutions.
Hi, everyone.
Yes. That's my meeting. Let
me share questions with everyone here.
Thank you.
Okay. Your sound is a little muffled, so I don't know what you just said.
I'll be right back. Okay, I'm just sharing questions with each of those rooms.
Perfect. Thank you.
Hi, folks. I'm just going to share some questions with Hi, Lisa. Sorry, I'm in both rooms. I'm sharing questions right now. So I just asked if perhaps we can have in this group maybe someone to facilitate discussion and then maybe someone also to take brief notes who will be able to share it with the organizers afterwards.
Awesome. Thanks, Lisa.
It seems like you folks are okay here, yes?
Yes, we're good.
Okay, awesome. I just asked that maybe one of you can facilitate discussion and someone take notes, please, and then share. Awesome. I'm gonna go to the other room because I think they need a little bit more help.
Perfect. Thank you. Awesome. Maybe we can go to Jane next.
Okay, folks, I'm here to participate, here to help.
Okay, folks, so I'll just going to jump in here. I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Lisa. I am in Toronto. I am a housing activist, a feminist housing activist, and a person with lived experience. I've done some work in community research. I kind of feel like this is my jam. And I always find these situations a little bit awkward, but I want to jump in and just introduce myself. I'm from Toronto, talking to you from Treaty 13, and I'm seeing some of the questions. And I'm thinking maybe we should just briefly introduce each other and then come together and start to break it all down. So I'm going to pass it over to Jacob. Maybe you can introduce yourself and you can pass it off to somebody else and we'll get started.
Thank you, Lisa. Jacob Ngok is my name. I'm an urban planner in Bamenda City, Cameroon. And indeed, I've worked with slums and housing, and probably maybe if there are anything we'll share, we'll be able to share together. Over to next person.
Who wants to jump in next and introduce themselves?
Hi, I'm Danica. I am a residence service caseworker at the Redwood, which is an emergency shelter for women and children fleeing abuse.
Awesome. Who wants to jump in next? Simone, are you there?
Hello, Lisa. I'm Professor A.R. Siddiqui from India. I'm working as a professor in University of Allahabad and working on urban environment. I have supervised 4 or 5 theses in related field. Totally, I have expertise in application of remote sensing and GIS in urban landscape. But in the recent, we are trying to find out some pertinent issues, like you have chosen this topic related to housing problem. Because as a geographer, we know India is having 2.4% geographical area, having different environment system. Sometimes topic is common, but in India, take an example of there are glaciers, there are desert and coastal ecosystem, plain ecosystem. So there are different aspects related to the livelihood opportunities and employment opportunities. So there are some pertinent topic. Many speakers are highlighting only common topic, homelessness. But in different environment system, we are having different types of problems. So there is a need to identify in terms of geographical location, particularly in large urban agglomerations. Take an example of India. In India, 53 metropolitan cities are in India. And our government already announced 2.94 crore housing facilities to those who are having homelessness. So in every diverse topography, in every diverse environment system, we have to identify the problem. So many speakers have highlighted their specific study related to their country. But as a geographer, I want to draw to your attention towards take an example of where a large urban agglomeration and plural societies are there. And sometimes there is a difference, disturbance. Sometimes there is a political instability or communal violence. So there are different types of situations. So we have to make an intensive study of population characteristics, like what is the pattern of any particular area, region, state, or country, or city. There are different types of space, physical space, social space, and economic space, and individual space. So every aspect is important in my view. So this is my perception regarding. Yeah. Thank you.
That is so fantastic. I see that Simone and Sarah, if you want to pipe up and just say hello, introduce yourself, and then we'll dig in. Simone, are you there? I can't quite hear you.
Hi, Lisa. I see that Simone said that she's in a loud place and can't talk, but I'm happy to introduce myself. I'm Alex Vigo. I'm the Deputy Director of the World Urban Pavilion. I'll talk a little bit more about the pavilion later on, but we're focused on knowledge, innovation, and transformations. And this here is my colleague who organized the whole session.
Hello, Ilda Cordero, Director of Programs at UEF.
So perhaps, Lisa, I turn to you. I'm kind of assigning you as the moderator, I suppose. I can obviously help out as well, and Ilda as well. But it would be great if we can dive into the questions, and perhaps, because we will want to have someone from this group speak for about 3 to 4 minutes afterwards, just sharing kind of what we've talked about. The questions are in the chat there. I believe we have them. It's breakout room 2. So the first one is, what innovative housing models have proven successful in addressing the needs of women and gender diverse people?
The floor is open now.
Sorry, could you just repeat what the question was? I'm looking at the chat and I'm seeing 3 different questions, and the first one is how can
Exactly.
Okay.
Great. Lisa, the questions that you have are the correct ones. I have chat from both rooms, so please, if you could read the question out for the group, and then if our guests can respond.
Okay, so the questions that I have here are, we'll start with the first one. How can stakeholders from different sectors, that is government, private, nonprofit, collaborate with lived experts to effectively address housing inequities, including homelessness? So I'm going to throw it over to you, Jacob. Do you want to start us off?
Yeah, thank you for giving me the floor as to that. We see housing in itself is something that, like we've said, is just more than the roof over somebody's head. That's the first thing. Now, in addressing housing, it is not, you have to look at the environment, because there are times that the policies, because those stakeholders, government wants to say that I'm building low-cost housing. Sometimes are those houses really low-cost housing? Because where the collaboration is not there is you build those houses, maybe they don't even suit the standards of those who want to live inside, and you believe that they should live inside. So that collaboration should be on the basis that in designing the houses, you should be able to get from those who are going to live in the houses, what are their models? What do they need in their environment? Maybe they may not need what do you call it? A lot of terracing. You should be able to hear from them. If they need maybe gardening, you should be able to hear from them. But if you say that no, because I'm designing low-cost housing, I'm going to make everything uniform, sometimes you send the people inside there, they don't have actually, it does not fulfill the true value of housing as it's supposed to be. And that is what that collaboration between, it must be, first of all, especially in terms of enabling environment. It is the government that has to provide. That's the government must provide an enabling environment. What is enabling environment? It must be able to provide to ensure that there are utilities to that particular area. There should be water, there should be electricity. That is the role of the government. When it now comes to the issue of designing the design should be done in partnership. When it comes now to construction, it should be done as that the other partners are supposed to supervise. The supervision here is to ensure that the ideas, because what I want as a house for myself may not be what another person wants as a house for himself, but then there are standards. So the idea of supervision now is to ensure that the standards are properly put into place. That is what I can contribute in this, so that it is not a one-man show. It must be a collaborative effort. It must be seen on the basis that the government on one side creates that enabling environment. All the other stakeholders, the developers, they are even brokers, they are housing brokers. They should also be able to get exactly what the society needs before even going into construction.
Oh my goodness, I love that so much. I wonder if, do I call you Professor Siddiqui? I wonder if you want to maybe jump in after this, because a couple of the things that you were saying earlier, I think really speaks to what Jacob was moving on. You were talking about geographies and about how in India, you know, you go from deserts, you have glaciers, you have all of these topographies.
One point I want to add, madam, I have forgotten, because we are talking about the homelessness and other important issues. But in my view, the minimum required facilities, minimum required conditions for the any people varies from area to area, because we are having different order of cities, and you cannot compare the issue of Canada with the issue of Bangladesh, Bhutan, or Sri Lanka, or in India. So affordability, accessibility, and health security, and every condition related to security varies from area to area. And we have to give a focus on at local level, and what is their location and how much population are there, and what types of opportunities are there. Particularly, I am giving emphasis on types of occupation. If the area is having barren, there is no opportunity of agricultural practices or livestock economy, and there are different types of occupation. So on that particular remote location, what type problem may be there, in particularly in a metropolitan city, what type of problem cities, because in Delhi, in Mumbai, Kolkata, there are metropolitan cities. So our expectation will be more. But in rural area, level of expectation of any individual is less. And this is very important aspect, particularly related with the problem related with the elderly population. Take an example, those who are in government job, they are having pension after retirement. But those population were not in a government job, and they were in their own job or labor class. So they are having problem of homelessness after retirement and after the attaining of the age of 65. So every aspect is important. Female work participation, ratio of male work participation, ratio of female work participation, types of occupation, and opportunities of livable conditions and livelihood condition. So every aspect should be judged in the context of locations of the populations, in my view.
Thanks, Lisa. I see you messaging me there. I want to respond to something that Jacob said regarding affordable housing, and is it actually affordable for those who are living in it, or those who it's intended for? One of the issues that we currently have in Canada is we've begun to start redefining affordable housing in, I would say, kind of the opposite direction of where we should be going. You know, affordable housing, generally the definition is accepted by 30% of the person's income. Recently, CMHC, I believe, has redefined affordable housing as 80% of market rate. I mean, this is, you know, in Canada, our housing is going up and up, and it doesn't seem like it's really changing. The Prime Minister of Canada recently said he wants to maintain the investments that people have invested in their housing. So there really is no agenda to lower affordable housing. So when we talk about, is affordable housing actually intended for the people it's for? No, it doesn't seem like it is right now. That's something that Canada is dealing with. And I think we need to look to our partners to try to address that. The other component that I found quite interesting is this concept of designing in partnership. You know, we can innovate when it comes to the way buildings are using energy or materials, but we can also be innovating when it comes to society, right? Social. Accessibility has become a major topic here in Toronto. And the accessibility conversation, while it's partly led by something that we have called accessibility standards in Ontario, there's legislation around it. It's also being pushed and led by a private developer here in Toronto, the Daniels Corporation, where they partnered with a group called the Rick Anson Foundation, who's developed gold standards around accessibility. And I think it's important that when we talk about these conversations and partnerships, when we're engaging with stakeholders, we have different communications with each of the partners. On the one side, when we're engaging with, let's say, all of society, providing housing that is accessible is providing a net positive to everybody, not just to those who need it. Sliding doors, for an example, is something that was created because of accessibility. But at the same time, when we're speaking to the private sector, having these accessibility standards is a new market, right? It's a market for people that need accessibility access. Other topics that are related to this are, you know, also aging in place. Obviously, the conversation today is about gender, right? Pregnancy within housing, homelessness and pregnancy. So, you know, when we're engaging these stakeholders, speaking the language that, you know, that speaks to them, whether it be economic or quality of life, both play a critical role in our conversations.
Mute yourself, Lisa.
No, I think no, I don't. Indeed, from the comments that he's made, you see, one thing about housing is government can never take the lead. The lead is the private sector because those are the real consumers, and therefore, when you are drawing up a policy, look at a housing policy that gives at least some leverage to the private sector to come in as a full partner. Once the private sector comes in as a full partner, it enables housing development to the taste of every society. So at least that is because normally what we usually think about is that government like I always say, all what government should do is create the possibilities. Like when it now comes to issue of housing financing, it is the private sector that definitely can quickly have the capital as far as housing financing is concerned, not even the government. So some of those issues, because that is when you want to draw a mortgage. I know in a vast country you talk about mortgages and so on, but now once it is done on the basis of competitiveness, where the private sector can only be regulated by the laws and so on, it gives the leverage and leeway for housing to be at the level and reach of all the scales of the society.
Thank you, Jacob. And I do notice that Simone has left a comment in chat. I'll just read it aloud because Simone is in too loud of a room. I believe they need to first be willing to actually listen to those with lived experience. We need to include them in planning and creating new programs or changes to existing programs. Ideally, there should be 1 or 2 people with lived experience working or volunteering with these organizations and groups to create impactful change that will make a difference. Whether poll surveys, having open house meetings, each city and province territory will have different needs that needs to be taken into consideration as well. In the shop, we will often ask our guests about their experiences so we can change them. Very, very good point. And I also think this speaks to the importance of having disaggregated data and knowledge. That was another item that was brought up by our panelists today. You know, we're often looking at challenges in an aggregated manner. And I think when you talk about provinces and territories will have different needs, that is so critical to recognize, and different groups, right? Pregnancy, again, was another topic. I am cognizant of the time, and there are two more questions. If I may just transfer to the next question. I will read it aloud. How can we foster greater community understanding, involvement, and advocacy for housing and homelessness justice? And I actually think Simone touched on this when she talked about having people involved in the organization, working with the organizations, whether they be volunteers or, of course, I think even paying these community members is almost a way of creating local economic benefit. And that is something that we're seeing a little bit here in Canada, and hopefully in other parts of the world as well. But also what Simone was saying regarding the surveys, right? We have tools, we know what we need to do. We just need to help stakeholders, help those with power understand the importance of these tools to use them. So just connecting to Simone saying for question 2 there, perhaps Lisa, maybe you have anything additional to say?
I love what the richness of this conversation and the impromptu and the passion behind it. I first want to acknowledge that. I think of a quote where there is, if you're not at the table, chances are you're on the menu. And I think that that goes back to what Simone is saying. I'm here as somebody who lives it, who has lived it, who can see both sides of the system. And I think that bringing people together to share those understandings and to talk about in a spirit of well-being and serious advancements of these questions are so important. So while I have nothing really to add, I can't help but kind of take the bits that people in this breakout room and our learned speakers have shared, meaning bringing a lot of intelligence together. The lived experience with the academics is just so key. So I really appreciate that.
Jacob, I see your microphone unmuted. Do you have anything to add?
No, I will end it. I think the only thing I can add here is when you talk about community, you see, Forrest, you going back to the neighborhood. And what makes housing very interesting at the level of neighborhood, that is community, is that they share common infrastructure. And therefore, what you will be doing in order to do is, when you come to such an area, you'll be looking at community infrastructure that can be maintained. Because, like I said, housing is not just that roof, but housing encompasses that environment and so on. So when you now come to that community level, in order to foster them, ensure that they have what we call community-owned infrastructure. Well, what can we be talking about some of this community-owned infrastructure? If there's a neighborhood tap, fountain, water fountain, how does it function to make sure that that housing is complete? And therefore, that community infrastructure now is like a common infrastructure that all of them are united together to ensure. And when it even comes to issues of drainage, because these are some of the issues in the neighborhoods, and that is a disturbed house, that should be community managed. Once you involve them in ensuring that those community infrastructures complement and make them have a livable environment, you will also be improving on the housing needs of that particular community. This is what I can add to that.
Thank you, Jacob. And I asked Simone and Danica, perhaps you can, Simone wrote something just as I was asking. In my city, it is hard to compete with the NIMBY mentality and the negative stereotypes and stigma associated with living unhoused. Many people refuse to see the bigger picture and real problems because they aren't affected. We can continue to speak about it until people finally listen and understand, which, of course, is one strategy, bringing more attention and advocacy and awareness. But it's also, I think, about, the government. I think the government needs to take a leadership role, right? Setting policies, setting legislation. I don't know how you would help people understand, through legislation other than through education. But I think somebody does need to take a leadership role. Sadiq, do you have anything to add on question number 2, or perhaps in response to Simone? I see Lisa's hand is raised too. Maybe Lisa, you'd like to share something.
So, what was I going to say? It's completely, I'll come back. I had another thought in there. Sorry.
Sure. Then I turn to Sadiq. Sadiq, I assume your silence means you have nothing to add. And if that's the case, if Lisa hasn't remembered her thought yet, I will move to question 3.
I'll jump in here just really quickly. I do think to your point just a moment ago, you were talking about the role the government plays. And what I really am intrigued about is this idea of mobilizing knowledge and power literacy for survivors and for people with lived experience. I think personally, I find that very interesting because when you kind of make do and you're kind of in this ad hoc moment of trying to endure and survive these systems that of affordability or the livability of spaces that don't meet core need, particularly for women-led families, I think about how we come together and we meet our own needs, or we do our best to meet our own needs together. And so I just kind of want to have another space for communities coming together to meet our own needs in the face of this idea that government isn't showing up. And so I always want to leave room at that part of the table where we can come together and we can foster our own solutions. And we can maybe close the gap together through knowledge mobilization and power literacy.
I absolutely love that, Lisa. And I think that is, what I'm starting to see, at least here in Toronto, is communities are starting to, I see it as they're starting to shift more towards this organized community approach to push back against governments. We definitely see it here in Regent Park. I consider Regent Park probably one of the most, if not the most organized community in Toronto. In the community that I live in Toronto, it's called High Park. We have about 11 to 14 high rises. There's about 2,000 people living there. It was a very inactive community. We don't have commercial or anything. It's just residential. And then the last year we started to see what I call, I guess, community activists. You know, they've created their own Facebook groups. They've created their own nonprofit organizations, you know, whether they're large or small, and they're starting to push back against the landlords. And the next step what I see my community going is starting to integrate these different community groups to push back. So that's something that I'm seeing, and hopefully we can keep the momentum. But I mean, when you're unpaid, right, and you're volunteering in this capacity, it really requires some strong motivation by the community. If I may, we would like to kind of close the conversation soon, so we have some time to do the last questions. I apologize, we're running through these questions relatively fast here. But the last question is, what strategies can be implemented to ensure the voices of women and gender diverse people are central in discussions of housing policy, legislative changes, and funding envelopes for housing? Would anyone like to take this? This one first.
I think women should talk first. This women in the house should say something.
Can I just say how wonderful that was? I just think that's so great. Like, there's a time for all of us to speak, and I just love how you formalized that.
Well, you see, if I may add something to that, can I say something? If I may add something to that, the issue about women, because certainly the first basis of housing is land. Therefore, we must be able to ensure equitable access to land by women. There are some societies which discriminate women from owning land, And therefore, that also disadvantage them from having access to housing. And if that is done, that is what we call equitable access to land. That is to the secure tenure. Because once you have secure tenure, that's the first aspect that you consider that you can now develop. Because otherwise, why do persons maybe you have squatters and so on? It's because that they don't have that security of tenure. And there's no society, because we know today that women still form the majority of the more than 7 billion population that we have in the world. And if we were to consider that we encourage them and give them that rights to secure tenure as we give to men in some areas, it will go a long way to do that. Secondly, like I say, you see, when it comes to mortgage issues, when we carry out some research here, especially housing financing, women are more diligent when it comes to handling reimbursements of funds, and therefore they should also, because what are the collaterals that can be used for them to have access to finance? It is that the land certificates and so on. And therefore, if that is done, therefore it gives them the leverage to equally own housing and come out of homelessness. And in doing so, the land certificates are so that they use as mortgage, and with the prudency that we see that women can manage finances, they will be able to have access to land and therefore not be homeless as we think. That is my take.
Yeah, I totally agree that land acquisition is a major key, and the initial one to have equitable access to housing and the housing disparities. And in fact, that is a major topic of issue with our dialogue, especially tomorrow with the Indigenous women and their land dislocation, and trying to claim back some of that in order to build. Does anyone else have any comments? That was very, very good.
I do see that Donica wrote something here. I'll just read it off. Government official also there's action hearing firsthand from those with lived experiences and taking that information and voices seriously when making decisions. Maybe town hall meetings, visiting local shelters, communities, etc. Coming down to the level of those they are helping to actually learn from. Completely agree with this, and something I would also like to add is, oftentimes the loudest voices are not always the majority, and people who are engaging in, let's say, some of these town hall meetings or something like that, the ones engaging with governments, are the ones who are the loudest, right? The ones who want to share. And I think we need to use these examples you hear, like visiting local shelters, to create those opportunities where the quiet voices are part of the conversation now. Sadiq, do you have anything you would like to add as well? And then after that, we'll wrap up the conversation.
Yes, Dr. Jacob already given some important solution, discuss about the solution. But in particularly in the cities, we have to make a study about the percentage of work participation, because in West Asian countries and Indian scenario, the percentage of female work participation is low. In cities, we are having different economic strata. Support, we are having favorable condition like in order to assess about the affordability, accessibility, and livable condition. Again, so, but we are divided. Their population is heterogeneous group, and suppose there are communities divided in different caste, different religion, and we are having situation to purchase any land in any particular area. But the matter is that particular location is safe or not. So security concern is more important, and age concern is more important. So every aspect, like Mr. Jacob already highlighted, economic strata, age structure, and types of communities, should be given consideration, a serious consideration when we are talking about the solution.
Thank you, Mr. Deep. And with that, last comment is, can we nominate someone in this group to share 3-4 minutes, kind of summary during the last conclusion? Is there anyone here who would like to just summarize the general conversation?
I mean, I can. I feel like Jacob is so eloquent and so well spoken that you'd be very well served to do that as well. But if no one else does, I'll show up and do my best.
I support you. I support you to represent us.
Thank you so much, Lisa. So I'll leave it to you to summarize just 3-4 minutes, nothing major, but it will be part of the outcome document that will be shared with UN Habitat's Urban Thinkers Campus program. And it will be a major contribution document. So I really appreciate the group here for going through these questions. And I will now end the breakout room as we wrap up in our closing session. Folks, we're just going to bring the in-person group back to their seats, and then we're going to do the closing portion of our meeting. We'll be done in about 15 minutes. Sorry, we'll be getting everyone back to their seats in about 30 seconds, and the meeting in its entirety will be done in about Everyone can hear you on the computer.
Okay, good. Thank you. Welcome back. And I hope you had a very engaging discussion on the questions that were proposed to you. Now, I would like to just have a quick moment or opportunity to have your representative from your group just highlight the key, maybe 3 or 4 key highlights of the discussion that took place. And if you could begin by saying what your questions were and then what some of the key highlights. We have 15 minutes designated to this, and then it's going to be closing. So let's start with the in-person, the first group that was on that corner. Who is the representative? And if you can come up. Is there a representative? Who's the person that's going to share the key highlights of that discussion group? Okay, we'll move on to the second group. Is there someone that has been selected? If you can just come here, just say what your questions were and then present 3 or 4 key highlights. Thank you. Hi. There we go.
So our breakout room looked at the first question. What innovative housing models have proven successful in addressing the needs of women and gender diverse people? And so what came up quite a bit was modular housing, flexible and scalable, participation of residents in the design and build of passive and sustainable options, mixed use, passive needs, more architects with this knowledge, need for more builders to advocate for the design for single mothers, consider ethno-specific developments, meet the needs of Indigenous women and girls and their distinct issues and consider the context, one-stop shop for housing, accessibility and consider universal design and human-centered design in future developments. And reminder, women are not homogeneous groups, different life stages, employment needs, family needs, and also intersectional approach with those who are vulnerable. Consider places to gather similar to Regent Park. That's crucial to a vibrant community. And participatory approach, ensuring the needs of gender diverse people are also front and center and accounted for. And gender sensitive response to planning, prioritize housing to present, pregnant and expecting mothers and families. And then finally, oversight and accountability to prioritize and ensure the effective implementation of women and specific gender diverse housing solutions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Those are great recommendations and potential solutions. Thank you for sharing. Now I'd like to go into one of the virtual sessions. And if you can just,
Yeah, I'm happy to hop in there for our breakout room. So we had our first question is, what innovative housing models have proven successful in addressing the needs of women, gender diverse folks? And we found that any model that centers lived experience, guiding the work and setting the principles, leading the way, are an integral part of governance. Their input is utilized effectively, tend to have the best outcomes. And most success in, retaining folks and building the housing that best meets folks' needs. What specific changes to housing policies and legislation are necessary? Someone in our group brought up that in Manitoba, they announced new or additional funding for the housing benefit with a few different streams. So anyone experiencing gender-based violence, homelessness, mental health, and substance use, you can apply through those streams. And she had seen, clients that she worked with at her shelter have great success easily applying for it because the barriers were quite low flow in order to access it. You know, they made it wasn't a comprehensive or overwhelming process to apply for that help. It was easily streamlined. There was a list of agencies who can help folks fill out that information. And so, you know, the more accessible you make a process, always the better the outcome. And it helped folks with either mortgages and their rent. Really anybody can access it. And something else we talked about is that whenever we discuss innovative solutions, we're always applying that intersectional gender lens. One of the other things we talked about is what strategies can be implemented. So really, we sort of discussing creative, clear methods and approaches when collecting evidence with lived experience, going beyond statistical evidence, as it tends to miss how women and gender diverse folks experience homelessness because it's often invisible, and statistical evidence is usually collected from things that we can see. You know, and at the Women's Network, we value that lived experience narratives and stories and oral ways of communicating just as much as that statistical data or collecting evidence through survey. And we also talked a little bit about innovative cooperative housing models in Vancouver, where you see, you know, different generations working and living together, people from diverse backgrounds. So it's not just out in your community, but even just in your building where folks have affordable units that meet their needs. And then quickly, what role should local, you know, all levels of government play in implementing policy changes? Obviously, investing in models that prioritize affordable housing and really getting that definition of affordable housing right, because right now we don't have that. And then putting policies in place that, you know, really make sure developers are building real, true, meaningful, affordable housing that, you know, rent geared to income sort of housing cost. Otherwise, you know, developers aren't necessarily going to build affordable housing. They're a business after all in a capitalistic system. So it's always about profit over people. So really, the right to housing tells us that housing is a right and shouldn't necessarily be about profit margins, but it should be about people. So those were sort of the things that came up in our discussion.
Thank you, Stefania. And yes, I totally agree that the models for affordable housing, safe, affordable, and fair and just housing has to be reestablished and re-examined. We now on to our last virtual group. If you can, someone can please present your final outcomes and key highlights.
Hi, everyone. I am happy to share breakout 2 and our feedback. I just want to start by saying how delightfully international this was. It's a privilege to be able to share what we discussed. The first question that we had was, how can stakeholders from different sectors collaborate with lived experts to effectively address housing inequities, including homelessness? And I think that one of the key segues into things is that we all agreed that it's more than a roof over our heads, and that policies in the locality and the region that we're speaking about solutions for are really key and should really drive these initiatives. The designing starts with those who are living in them first and foremost. It is not something that comes from on high. It is something that is done at the table collaboratively. And that was really a thread that spread all the way through these 3 questions. I really loved a quote that one of the participants said about enabling an enabling environment. And so the idea is that you have to set the stage to bring the enablers together to come and map these things. And it's about self-determination and bringing individuals together from different perspectives, from different topographies or geographies. Some people will be in the mountains. Some people will be in large municipal places or in rural situations. And that a solution in Canada is not a solution in India or in Cameroon or in Arkansas, for example. That homelessness ranges from region to region. And so maybe the word that came to mind for me was like this hyper-local focus and how that changes our expectations of what affordability is. That affordability for the elderly population is different than the rural and metropolitan needs. And there are many aspects to consider. I think also that the fluctuating definition of redefining affordable housing was something that was a through line. And providing a quote net positive to everyone is really key. The second question that we talked about was, how can we foster greater community understanding, involvement, and advocacy for housing and homelessness gesture? And once again, we came to the same conclusion that this is not a one-size-fits-all thing, nor should it be. It's a very local phenomena, and that it involves mapping where we are and where those questions are being posed. I think the importance of lived experience and thinking about what common infrastructure actually engages and what that means is really important to complement the quote livable environment. I also think the importance of mobilizing ourselves to do the work and not wait for governments to do the work for us is really, really key. And that brings us to our third question. What strategies can be implemented to ensure the voices of women and gender diverse people are central in discussions of housing policy, legislative changes, and funding envelopes for housing? And I think, and I really enjoyed the equitable asset distribution to women that was discussed. I want to give a shout out to the people in breakout room 2 who were very, just very open about ensuring that this redistributed, regenerative distribution of assets should include actively women, children, and families. And so again, in closing, the diverse voices and the economic strata, the age concerns, the safety concerns that different people with lived experience have has to be primary to answering all these questions when we think about housing affordability. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much. If I could have the facilitators, if you can just send me the summary that you presented based on your questions and send it to. Oh, I'm sorry. I called out. No, please, please, please. I had called out and no one approached. So there you
Hi there, my name is Elena Carter. I'm a carpenter and I was in a really good breakout group. So our first question was, what are the primary barriers faced by women and gender diverse people in accessing safe and affordable housing? So obviously the lack of housing, and there is a complexity of just what it means to navigate through the system, the wait lists, the lack of the shelter flexibility as well. When people go into a shelter, they have a lot of rules, and you're kicked out at a certain time, and whether you're allowed back in, you have to qualify for certain things. I would say apprehension to going there as well. It's not very inviting. It's noisy, and there are, I brought up the restrictions as well. And somebody in our group said that the system can't really determine the eligibility from the wait list. So it's hard to really put people where they would be best suited. On the policy side, there's no assessment of what people need. And the term affordable housing was also, I think, too general. So, there's affordable housing, deeply affordable housing, and based on the market value, deeply affordable housing we found wasn't affordable either. So that goes into what are the systemic issues contributing to housing inequities, including homelessness for women and gender diverse people. So how affordability is defined, the equation, somebody said it's regarding the 60th income percentile, and then so it's kind of a mathematical qualification that really needs to be lowered and revisited. For myself, I'm finding that one of the systemic barriers could be the building codes. I think that they're pretty much old school, and even though our union, for example, is trying to prove that mass timber could be revisited, it's very hard for the developers and to convince them that the building codes need to be changed.
and revisited for, you know, new technologies that are here, like net positive and net zero building. Also, there is no policy incentives for homeowners to open up their vacancies. So, you know, there's a lot of people that have where their kids are no longer living there. There's one person living in the home, and there's no incentive for this room that's available in the condos or in single family dwellings to have somebody move in. I also found that there's just lack of mental health care and access to it. So, you know, I'm trying to find either affordable housing or trying to get into a shelter in the meantime. There's a lot of people that probably shouldn't be in the shelter. And if we had more places for people suffering from addiction and mental health problems, then that could possibly, you know, help free up some space in the shelters. And so this is where the healthcare has to come in to play, and we need more educators out there and you know more healthcare professionals to service them. Some of the other systemic issues as well are just where the supports are for people that need affordable housing. So if you're in the outskirts, you know, you don't have, you know, anything close by, from daycare to, you know, going shopping at a store to maybe even your family being around. You know, you have the cost of transit, which probably you can afford, but if you live in the downtown core, you have everything, you know, right there. The last question was, what role can community-based organizations and nonprofits play in providing housing and homeless solutions? So I think, as always, right, when the government falls short, then who's left to pick up the slack, right? It's all of us here. So, you know, that's why the charities exist in the first place. It's because somebody's dropped the ball somewhere, and it's individuals that start, they get a little group together, the groups grow bigger, and then that's how you get the larger charities and the people that actually are caring for our neighbors and our communities, right? So that is the role, that is the essential role, and we can't, you know, we can't do without those. So more government funding to an organization to help those nonprofits and community-based organizations is definitely needed. I know that there's, you know, tons and tons of research that everybody is doing, all the academics, and it's needed. But it seems like it's falling on deaf ears of the government. So rather than just actually sequester the money and put it aside for people's use, if they could actually make it easier for everybody to not jump through all the hoops and just let them have their money and let them do with it what they need to do, which is always, you know, good and productive things, then it would make things a lot easier. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It always seems that the loudest voices are the ones that are silenced actually is from the local communities. And that's why grassroots is so important, because it really needs to come from locally and going upwards. And having said that, it's probably what we seem to never really see. There's the voices or the lived experiences exist in the local level, but when it comes to the regional or the federal level, there's no one there really representing those silent voices. And women and marginalized groups are, you know, their voices are really not even present. And I know this is a discussion that we've talked again and again and again, but how do we get these people on the table is really the question. Not only do we need to advocate for them and to them, but it's almost like the governments need to be advocating, really, because there's only so much we can yell or scream, and if no one is listening, or if our voices are silenced again and again, the issues continue and very little change. And we all know that NIMBYism is a huge problem. It always has been. Nobody wants it in their backyard. It always then it comes to the housing values decrease, and you know, then all the issues that come. Mental health is another big issue, and we're actually going to talk about a little about that on Thursday with Fred Victor, who is a charitable nonprofit organization that does a lot of work in homelessness and has shelters for women and families and men. So it'll be very interesting to see how they see the progress and what barriers that they still have to overcome to make it, because we know shelters are overbooked, especially with mental health as it is now. And there's really, like you said, I think the shelters were there for really family and homeless, and now it's become for everyone, specifically mental health or addictions are a big problem in our society. I would like to now, thank you so much for all the insights and valuable input that you have made. It's so integral and crucial. I think this is a venue, or it's a voice, a platform of using the lens of women and people, gender diverse people, and more so because what I'm hoping to do is collecting all your, the issues that you've professed and also the solutions or recommendations, put it into a report. It's going back to the team for their input. And then this report is going to the World Urban Campaign, which is they're an umbrella under the UN Habitat, and they're going to present, they're going to put our recommendations into their own report and then have a platform at that global level internationally and present what some of the issues are that we have perceived through the view of women and gender diverse people. And it almost seems like there's so, women is one, then there's Indigenous women, which is a whole different aspect. And I'm so proud that Marie is going to lead that discussion tomorrow. And we're going to focus on Indigenous women and gender diverse people. And then on Thursday, we're looking at, the whole shelters and what programs and services are there. And that we hope will then be presented by UN Habitat at a global level. So let's see what happens. I would like to now move into closing. I'm going to call my colleague Alex Venuto, who's the Deputy Director of the World Urban Pavilion, to give us a few comments or some dialogue on the pavilion events.
Yeah. Thank you, Hilda. Yes, I'm just going to talk briefly about the World Urban Pavilion in Regent Park. I understand that Marie will speak after me and close the session, yes? Okay, fantastic. All I want to do is touch on the World Urban Pavilion itself. The pavilion, for short, is where you are today. It's the physical space. But the pavilion is also so much more. It is a global knowledge exchange hub for sustainable urbanization and best practices. We are focused on action-oriented approaches. Importantly, we are a strategic collaboration between United Nations, the Government of Canada, specifically Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, as well as Urban Economy Forum is the secretariat, and we are supported by the Daniels Corporation as well. Importantly about the pavilion is we are focused in three critical areas. The first one being knowledge, the second one being innovation, and the third one being transformation. And transformation in the form of solutions. We heard today from a number of organizations about that knowledge component, understanding those challenges and trends, but also understanding how we can leverage that into opportunities, areas that we could really focus our resources. And critically, it's also about that disaggregation of data. When we lump all that data into one aggregate, we're missing some of these key areas that we're talking about. One of the items that had never occurred to me before was pregnancy and housing. We talk about this conversation of aging in place, but I've never heard these conversations of transgenerational housing talk about pregnancy. I think that's something key that's missing in understanding how we can address that. Also, pregnancy and homelessness is critical as well. When we talk about the pavilion and innovation, it's about leveraging that knowledge, that data, and understanding how we can connect what was previously disconnected to create some sort of synergies. For an example, we talk about Canada's National Housing Strategy. How can we leverage Canada's National Housing Strategy to meet, let's say, equitable goals within our country, or environmental policies, etc. And then the final area we're focused on at the pavilion is transformation, and transformation in the form of solutions, in the form of action. And that's what I want to focus most of my attention here in the next couple of paragraphs. In particular, when we talk about transformation, the pavilion is hosting a meeting on June 25th. That's part of what we call the Canada Frontrunner of Urban SDGs program. This is our flagship program focused on building national cohesion across the country. And when I say national cohesion, it means about bringing all stakeholders to the table. Private sector, city leaders, urban developers, financial institutions, but also community organizations, those people with lived experience. I'm so glad that I was able to hear today from the very well-organized WNHHN from Mary, from Stefania, and also from Arlene and Khalud, and your entire stakeholder. I believe that this organization, and I hope we can have a meeting following this, this conversation, because I think you can play a key role in this meeting coming up on June 25th, and in particular about building this national cohesion across Canada. We've already begun organizing the meeting. We'll have a number of stakeholders join us. And I hope the WNHHN will join us for this meeting as we begin building out this national cohesion. We plan to hold what we call a Canada Urban Forum, which is part of the UN Habitat program later in 2025, and better connecting this to Canada's presidency of the G7 nations. That'll also be held in 2025. We have already connected with some of our partners at the Government of Canada, who's expressed a very strong interest in bringing our conversation on housing, on women and urban SDGs to the G7 countries. And what we would like to do is introduce Canada urbanization as a model. I'm not saying Canada is perfect, but we can take some of these innovations, some of these lessons learned, help our country do better, and then really build out this model as we show it to the rest of the globe. And that means, you know, doing better when it comes to addressing Indigenous challenges, doing better when it comes to addressing women challenges and opportunities as well. So I do hope that the WNHHN will join us for this meeting on June 25th, and I look forward to having this meeting further on as well. With that being said, I will conclude my remarks and turn it back over to Ilda or Marie. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. And now I'm honored to bring back to the podium Marie, who is going to close day one with final comments and remarks. Thank you.
So words are very interesting things. They could take many meanings. You can talk and talk and talk and talk. And how do you all boil it down into something to take away? So I was looking at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that need to be achieved by 2030. And so one word, well, actually one phrase came to me. And what they all boil down to in our language is Mano Dumatsuan, which means living a good life. So if you look at each one of them and you translate and think about what they each mean, it boils right down to living a good life, which is what all of us human beings, I think there's 9 billion of us now, are trying to do. And it's up to us human beings to collaborate, cooperate, and help each other if we're going to survive. And one of our biggest relationships, Anishinaabe people anyway, is with the animals, the birds and the fish, and even the insect world, and then the cosmos above. And then I mentioned earlier this morning, the bones of our ancestors underground. If we are not able to collaborate to save human beings, then what will be left is those animals, the fish and the birds and the insects and the bones underground and the cosmos above. So I guess I want to say is let's do what we can to collaborate and help each other. And we heard some very interesting things this morning, like housing needs of pregnant women, intergenerational housing needs, how women are very vulnerable, how our voices are not heard, and how there needs to be accountability. And there needs to be very many different mixes of housing in order to meet the needs of people. And so what it boils down to again is how do we create community out of all of the things that we see around us. So anyway, I'll leave it there, and I thank you so much for coming out and hearing us, talking in the discussion groups, and for the folks that summarized everything for us. And also to all the speakers that came and brought their unique perspectives and knowledge. All of that is most appreciated. Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Yes, a very heartfelt thank you and appreciation for all our speakers, the moderators, the facilitators, our guests who joined us both virtually and in person. And I hope you will join us again tomorrow for day 2. Like I said, we are focusing on Indigenous women and housing challenges and looking for solutions and some support systems that are specific to Indigenous women locally, regionally, and nationally. I would also just like to let you know that it's the same Zoom meeting, and if you can join us by no later than 8:50, and we will begin at 9 o'clock. And for those who summarized the discussion notes for in regards to the breakout sessions, if you could maybe just do a very quick summary and send it to me, and Alex will put my email address on chat. That would be greatly appreciated. Can we, everybody, if you can have open up your camera so we can take a screenshot to share.
I was saying, I'll take a picture of what's in the back.
Also, actually, I would like that if you can open your cameras, and then we will take a photo here. Okay? Yes.
So everyone move to the.
Everybody, we all come here.
So TV people, open up your cameras as well. We'll put it on speaker view so we can see everyone.
Yeah, the stars. Here. You don't want.
There.
Okay.
Perfect.
Here. Hello. Just like that.
Oops, sorry, folks.
Ooh, I can't believe it. 1 second.
I think we'll have.
There we go.
Okay, there. Yeah. No. Thank you. Thank you. Have a good afternoon, evening. See you tomorrow.
Thank you, everyone.